March 2016. A thick, bone-chilling cold hung over the Appalachian forest near Beckley, West Virginia, where an abandoned wooden cabin stood alone among rotting trees. The beam from FBI Special Agent Hannah Mercer's flashlight cut through decades of stagnant darkness and landed on something no one expected to find here. Control. I need the evidence response team and the document examination unit to this cabin immediately. Her voice echoed off the moldy wooden walls, making the dead silence vibrate. What started as a routine property check, prompted by the landowner, had just turned into something else entirely. Something that might finally answer the question that had haunted Roanoke, Virginia for 59 years. Under a pried-up floorboard, Hannah found an old tin box wrapped in a yellowed plastic bag. Inside were a fake birth certificate, a photograph of a 6-year-old boy, and a barely legible note: "Never mention Virginia again." Those small items yanked the memory of Matthew Long's disappearance violently back from the past. For nearly 6 decades, Matthew's vanishing had been nothing but unanswered questions. A bright, gentle little boy who left for school one morning and never came home. An empty chair at the dinner table for decades. A bedroom his parents could never bring themselves to clear out. Before we go any further with this shocking story, please take 1 second to hit subscribe and like the video. Your support is what gives forgotten cases a chance to be seen again, and it makes sure the algorithm won't hide any future videos from you. The discovery of that tin box in the Beckley cabin wasn't just the first clue in 59 years. It was the domino that toppled decades of buried secrets in Appalachia. Because when the FBI traced the fake documents, they realized a man who had been interviewed back in 1972 should never have been allowed to walk away from the investigation. And when his true identity was finally confirmed, he wasn't some drifter or mysterious shadow figure. He was someone who had lived in the community for more than 40 years, trusted, greeted every weekend, carrying the secret no one could have imagined. The Matthew Long case isn't just a mystery that was simply solved. It's proof of a family's unbreakable determination to keep searching, of investigators who refused to let the file gather dust, and of genetic advances that finally gave a voice back to victims silenced for far too long. It's also the story of a community torn apart. When Matthew disappeared in 1972, suspicion spread through Roanoke like wildfire. Neighbors eyed each other warily. Families who had once been close grew distant. The search for the little boy exposed deep cracks in what everyone thought was a peaceful American town, and those cracks would explode when the truth finally came to light. What makes this case so haunting is that the answer was always close, terrifyingly close. The prime suspect had once sat across from police, attended Matthew's memorial services, shaken hands with the boy's family, stood in the crowd like any innocent citizen. All while carrying the truth no one dared believe. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. I'm always curious how far these stories travel and how they connect us across impossible distances. Tonight we're going back to Roanoke in 1972, following a decades-long search for the truth and reaching the jaw-dropping turning point that reopened one of Virginia's most mysterious cold cases. This is a story of loss, persistence, deception, and justice delayed, but never denied. Virginia, in the early 1970s, still had the slow, small-town rhythm of the American Southeast, especially in Roanoke, a hilly city where family, school, and church were the heartbeat of life. Kids still walked to school every morning, crossing quiet streets lined with early autumn gold leaves, never imagining danger. In the southwest neighborhood, the Long family lived in a 2-story wooden house. Thomas, the father who worked for the Norfolk and Western Railway; Evelyn, the mother, who taught first grade at the local elementary school; David, the serious, observant 10-year-old big brother; and 6-year-old Matthew, lively, bright, always carrying a sketch pad to draw anything that caught his curiosity. Their mornings followed the same comforting routine. Thomas left early for his shift. Evelyn made breakfast and straightened the boys' jackets. David usually checked his little brother's shoes and zipped his coat. Matthew always ran out to the yard for a few minutes before leaving, kicking fallen leaves while waiting for Mom's final reminder. The first tiny crack in that routine appeared when Evelyn noticed a dark green Ford F-100 pickup parked at the corner of Brandon Avenue several mornings in a row. In a neighborhood where strange vehicles were rare, the truck stood out, but in an era when utility workers, cable guys, or delivery drivers parked anywhere, she didn't think much of it beyond feeling it was out of place. David had also seen the man inside smoking and staring down the street, but he figured the guy was waiting for someone in the neighborhood. No one in the family imagined it could be connected to danger. The morning of September 28, 1972, was crisp and cool, with a pale high sky and the unmistakable smell of dry autumn leaves. Thomas left early as usual. Evelyn threw together a quick breakfast and hurried the boys out the door with their backpacks. David slung his on and walked a few steps ahead. Evelyn adjusted Matthew's scarf. The 6-year-old stepped off the porch, carrying his old sketch pad and an extra math worksheet from his teacher. The walk to school was only 2 blocks, a route every kid in the neighborhood walked alone. As Matthew stepped off the stone walkway, David spotted the green Ford again at the corner, this time parked closer to the intersection that led to the school. The man was still inside, head slightly tilted, hands on the steering wheel, just like the previous days. David hesitated for a second, feeling uneasy, but nothing obvious was happening. The truck wasn't moving toward them, and the engine was idling normally. Matthew didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He walked along the grass, quietly reciting a poem his teacher had assigned. When he got close to the corner, the first strange thing happened. Matthew tilted his head, as if someone had called his name. From behind, David saw his little brother stop abruptly. In that same moment, the green Ford eased forward just far enough to block David's line of sight. Even though they weren't far apart, David couldn't see what was happening on the other side of the truck. He sped up and yelled, "Matt!" But the autumn wind and traffic noise from the main road swallowed his voice. When David rounded the back of the truck, Matthew was gone from the intersection. No scream, no loud noise, just empty space looking straight down the hill that led out of town. David panicked, ran a few steps down the slope, hoping to spot his brother, but the road was deserted. He turned and sprinted home in terror, repeating over and over, "Matt's gone." Evelyn heard her older son's frantic screaming, rushed to the porch, and only caught fragments green truck intersection. Matt, not there. She dropped everything, ran down the walkway, and raced to the street, calling Matthew's name again and again. No answer. Within minutes, Thomas was called home. Neighbors poured out, and everyone fanned out in every direction for an urgent search. Some ran to the playground, others toward nearby trails, but 10 minutes was all it took for the effort to become chaotic. No one could pinpoint exactly where Matthew had vanished, and no one knew which way the truck had gone. With no other options left, Evelyn stumbled back to the kitchen, hands shaking violently as she picked up the phone and reported to police that her 6-year-old son had disappeared right in their own neighborhood. The Roanoke Police Department Communications Center received Evelyn Long's call just before 9:30 a.m. Logging a distraught and uncontrollable voice, the dispatcher immediately opened a missing child intake form and asked Evelyn for basic details: victim's name, age, description, clothing that morning, last seen time and location. The initial data was recorded by the book, Matthew Long, age 6, light brown hair, approximately 3'11", wearing a green wool jacket, beige pants, white sneakers. Left home around 8:55 a.m. and last seen at the corner of Brandon Avenue. The dispatcher asked whether there were any recent family disputes or internal conflicts. Evelyn said no. Under 1972 procedures, the case was initially classified as missing child, active search recommended, not yet meeting the criteria for probable abduction, because there was no direct evidence of forcible removal. Still, the family's panic and the extremely short disappearance window caused the dispatcher to internally escalate priority and request the nearest patrol unit. Patrol Unit 2B, just over a mile away, was redirected to the Long residence. A second unit from South Roanoke, was told to stand by in case the search needed to expand immediately. While coordinating with units in the field, the dispatcher continued verifying key details: distance from home to school, how long Matthew would normally take to walk, the moment David lost sight of him, and how familiar Matthew was with the route. This data helped assess the possibility the child had simply wandered off, and factor always considered before concluding stranger abduction. Information from the longs showed Matthew had never deviated from the route before. The path was short and familiar, and there was no reason for him to leave the playground or neighborhood. That made the dispatcher flag the case as time-sensitive. Rapid response was critical, because the chance of the child leaving the area increased with every passing minute. After verification was complete, the communication center alerted the shift commander. A decision was made per existing protocol: dispatch patrol to the scene, have the second unit check nearby intersections for a lost child or suspicious vehicles leaving the area. The dispatcher also contacted every patrol unit within a 2-mile radius with the alert and a brief description of Matthew. An internal broadcast went out over police radio: 6-year-old missing, possibly off school route, direction unknown. Every unit on patrol was asked to watch for a child matching the description in the southwest neighborhood. The classification remained at the initial level because evidence was still insufficient for abduction, but the unusually short disappearance window forced the center to raise response priority. Once the information was standardized and sent to the nearest patrol unit, 2B arrived at the Long home at 9:37 a.m. Took direct statements from Evelyn and David, then began the initial scene survey. The 2 officers quickly moved to the spot Matthew was last seen, the intersection of Brandon Avenue and the road leading out of the neighborhood. The disappearance point was narrowed using 3 reference points where David last saw his brother before losing sight, the route Matthew normally took to school, and the average walking speed of a 6-year-old over that distance. From David's account, the focal area was the strip of land between the grass curb and the asphalt, where the green Ford had reportedly been parked in recent days. The officers placed temporary stakes to mark a roughly 20-meter radius that covered the entire stretch Matthew had walked in the final minutes. After establishing the preliminary observation boundary, they examined environmental evidence using the standard outside-to-inside method: first the pavement, then the grass strip, then the soft soil near fences. The goal was to find anything unusual: skid marks, fresh tire tracks, dropped items, or disturbed vegetation. No notable brake marks were found on the road, but on the grass right at the intersection edge, one officer noticed an area of grass pressed flatter than normal, showing recent compression. That spot was flagged as a primary observation point. A few steps away, a narrow strip of dirt had uneven indentations, possibly consistent with children's shoe prints. But because neighbors and volunteers had already walked through the area before police arrived, it was impossible to confirm which prints, if any, belonged to Matthew. The scene officer tried to assess direction of force from print depth, but could not reach a clear conclusion. Near a residential wooden fence, a thin broken stick was recovered, but it had no evidentiary value. It could easily have come from kids playing days earlier. While examining the surroundings, police also noted anything that might have blocked witnesses' views: neighbors' parked cars, trash cans pulled out that morning, and tall bushes near the curb. Those elements were documented because they could have obscured sightlines at the exact moment of disappearance. After the scene survey, investigators established a search radius. The goal was a realistic perimeter based on elapsed time from disappearance to police arrival. Calculating that Matthew could walk roughly 350 meters in 10 minutes, officers set the primary search radius at 400 meters from the intersection. That circle covered 5 side streets, a shortcut to the playground, and the downhill road leading south toward thinner woods. Patrol requested the communications center pull updated area maps and forward them to supporting units in case the search needed rapid expansion. Meanwhile, officers on scene evaluated possible escape routes for the suspected vehicle, assuming the green Ford was involved. 3 main directions were noted: left onto the small highway, right into the neighborhood bordering woods, and straight down the hill toward the outskirts. Those routes were flagged for cross-reference with vehicle lists and reports from other patrols. Police also assessed ambient noise levels at the scene to determine whether Matthew's failure to cry out could be explained by environmental factors. Being close to a main road, passing traffic noise could easily have masked any unusual sounds. All initial scene findings were compiled into a rapid report: obstructed sightlines, compressed grass, unidentified objects, and the established search perimeter, and transmitted back to the center in case the focal area yielded no new evidence and the search needed to widen quickly. Immediately after securing the scene perimeter, the patrol unit shifted to witness statements, starting with David, the last person to see Matthew, and separating him from the crowd of adults to avoid psychological contamination before asking him to recount events chronologically. David said his brother was a few steps ahead and stopped near the corner as if someone called his name, though David heard no voice and couldn't see who might have been there. He only remembered the green truck blocking my view, and when he ran around the back of it, Matthew was gone. The truck description was carefully recorded: older pickup, dark green, worn condition, dim headlights, open bed with no cover. David also recalled the driver smoking, hands on the wheel, head tilted toward the window. When asked about the license plate, David vaguely remembered the first character might have been a G or a 6, but he wasn't sure. That statement was marked valuable, but requiring corroboration. After David, police canvassed residents near the intersection for independent observations. Mrs. Henderson, who lived directly across from the disappearance spot, said from her kitchen window she saw a dark green pickup parked at the corner around 8:45 a.m. before Matthew left home. She never saw anyone get in or out, but was certain the truck didn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood. She had lived there over 15 years and knew every neighbor's vehicle. Another neighbor, Mr. Lutz, reported seeing the same truck the previous afternoon, parked close to the curb for about 20 minutes before driving off. When he approached with his dog, he couldn't see the driver clearly because of tinted glass, but remembered the truck turning south down the hill. His statement was significant because it confirmed the vehicle had appeared multiple times, not just a random presence the morning Matthew vanished. A third witness, Miss Jacobs, was riding her bicycle through the area around 9 a.m. and stated that as she passed the intersection, the green truck had just started its engine and appeared ready to pull away. She didn't see any children nearby, but noted the truck started abruptly and sounded like an older engine. Her timeline helped align with the moment David lost sight of Matthew. From all statements collected, police compiled the suspect vehicle description: a late 1960s or early 1970s Ford F-100 or similar pickup, dark green worn condition, empty open bed, scratched or dirty windshield, weak headlights, likely driven by a middle-aged man who smoked and sat leaning toward the driver's window. Police also noted that the truck's repeated presence at different times suggested the driver may have been watching the children's school route or had another reason to return to the area multiple times. When cross-referencing timelines, Mrs. Henderson citing Matthew leaving home, David losing sight, and Miss Jacobs seeing the truck about to leave, the critical window was established as 8:45 to 9:05 a.m., with most accounts supporting the theory that the green truck was present exactly when Matthew reached the corner. Beyond the main witnesses, police questioned several other residents, most of whom only heard an engine or caught a glimpse of a vehicle passing. They couldn't offer specific details. Still, small notes like the truck sped down the hill or old engine noise were recorded case they could later help identify the vehicle's condition. When all witness statements were compiled, the dark green truck stood out as the single most consistent element from that morning. A temporary diagram was sketched marking parking positions, directions of travel, and engine start times according to witnesses. It was precisely these data points that forced the patrol units to reevaluate the nature of the incident. In the report sent back to the temporary command center, the officer in charge of the scene clearly listed 3 critical risk factors. First, Matthew disappeared in an extremely short window, only a few dozen seconds to 1 minute after David lost sight of him. Second, the repeated presence of a green Ford pickup truck that multiple witnesses described as appearing around the area where children walked to school on several consecutive days. Third, the fact that the truck was seen starting up and leaving the intersection at the exact moment Matthew was no longer at the spot where he had been standing. These factors, combined with the fact that Matthew was not a child who would wander far from home on his own, meant the case no longer fit the typical missing child category. When the summary report reached Roanoke PD headquarters, the acting shift commander immediately reviewed the conditions for reclassifying the case. Under 1972 regulations, police had to prove signs of force or clear evidence before opening a file as a confirmed abduction, but in exceptional circumstances, the convergence of risk factors with suspicious behavioral patterns was enough to elevate the handling to probable abduction in order to prevent the worst-case outcome. The on-scene data showed the green truck appeared before Matthew left home, was present at the exact moment of disappearance, and was confirmed by multiple witnesses to have left the area almost simultaneously with Matthew's disappearance. This was not enough for an absolute conclusion, but it was strong enough to treat the situation as highly unusual. After review, the commander decided to upgrade the case to missing child, high risk. This allowed the mobilization of greater resources and proactive expansion of the search area, even without direct evidence of a crime. The priority elevation order was transmitted over the internal radio, instructing all units within a 3-mile radius to be on the lookout for a green Ford pickup, matching the description provided by witnesses. Any similar vehicle spotted in the area was to be stopped for verification. The immediate escalation changed the deployment pattern. Instead of relying solely on local patrol units, the commander directed the involvement of a specialized investigation team consisting of 1 senior detective, 1 evidence technician, and 1 liaison officer tasked with compiling all witness statements into a unified system. An expanded crime scene diagram was ordered immediately, clearly marking the locations where witnesses saw the green truck, the direction it departed, and the estimated time of each sighting. At the same time, the commander ordered a check of all information related to recent child disappearances in neighboring areas, even without evidence of a connection. Because in child abduction cases, repeated stalking behavior or appearances in residential neighborhoods is often a significant indicator. The risk assessment also led police to consider the possibility that Matthew had been lured by a stranger. Although David did not hear a clear call, the fact that the boy stopped near the truck and appeared to turn toward an unidentified voice matched patterns seen in abductions involving approaches to children. Additionally, the very short distance from home to the intersection made it unreasonable that Matthew wandered off on his own. He always walked with his brother and had no habit of deviating from the route. All these factors were recorded under high concern indicators for handover to the specialized investigation team. Once the initial documentation was complete, the commander initiated the next phase, activation of the expanded investigation protocol. Additional forces included 3 reinforced patrol units, a team responsible for sweeping escape routes out of the neighborhood, and a unit dispatched to the nearest gas station to check whether anyone had seen the green truck that morning. Furthermore, the communications center was instructed to broadcast a detailed description of the vehicle and possible driver over a wider area to increase the chance of additional witness identification. Resource deployment also included orders for patrol units to check short-term parking areas near highways and locations where a vehicle could stop without drawing attention. The timeline of the truck's departure from the intersection was entered into a time chart to calculate the maximum distance the vehicle could have traveled within 5 to 10 minutes after the incident, helping determine the search radius on major roads. Simultaneously, police requested checks of nearby construction sites because isolated areas with many obstacles are environments easily exploited when a child is forcibly moved. The shift to high-risk status also prompted the lead investigator to urgently review records of strangers who had appeared in the area in recent months, including temporary workers, short-term renters, and owners of vehicles not registered to local residents. All this data was compiled in preparation for profiling potential suspects. The deployment of forces, elevation of handling priority, and transition to specialized investigation were all completed within less than 1 hour of the witness reports being consolidated. Roanoke PD decided to treat this as a situation with high potential for escalation, where time was of critical importance and an immediate large-scale response was deemed the best measure to maximize the chance of finding Matthew while he was still within close proximity to the neighborhood. After expanding the case to high risk and activating the specialized investigation, Roanoke PD's next step was to build a suspect profile based on the vehicle described by witnesses. The dark green Ford F-100 older model became the most prominent detail and virtually the sole anchor of the initial investigation phase. To narrow down possible subjects, the lead investigator requested direct contact with the Virginia DMV to extract a list of all registered Ford F-100, F-150, or equivalent model dark green pickups within the city of Roanoke and adjoining counties. Because it was 1972 and no modern electronic database existed, retrieval relied entirely on paper records and manually sorted lists. The DMV returned an initial list of 112 green Ford trucks from model years ranging from the late 1960s to early 1970s. The investigation team then filtered the list using 2 criteria: pickup truck body style and degree of match with witness descriptions of an older truck, dim headlights, empty bed. After eliminating vehicles owned by delivery companies and construction workers with documented work schedules, the list was reduced to 79 vehicles, requiring further scrutiny. The next step was to categorize owners into groups: long-term residents of the neighborhood near the scene, individuals living alone, frequent movers, and those with prior criminal records, even records unrelated to children, but showing patterns of abnormal behavior. The lead investigator prioritized males aged 25, 55, who lived alone or had changed addresses within the past 12 months, as these characteristics matched many known offender profiles involving stalking of children. The first group screened was owners living within 1 mile of the scene, 28 individuals in total. Police split into small teams to visit each address and quickly verify the vehicle's status. In many cases, owners had alibis. They were on morning shifts, the truck was in the shop, or a family member was using it at the time of the disappearance. Some trucks matched the color but were too new or clearly differed in bed condition or headlights and were eliminated. The second group consisted of owners living in outlying areas of Roanoke, 34 vehicles total. Verification was more difficult because many owners worked far away or were not home. Teams left notices requesting contact for absent owners and checked registration history for any unusual recent changes. Some license plates were faded or incompletely recorded in files, which slowed the process. When screening owners with prior records or offenses, the team discovered 7 individuals who owned trucks matching the description and had minor criminal histories such as petty theft or public disturbance. Although unrelated to children, this group was still treated as higher priority because law enforcement statistics of the era showed that individuals with deviant behavior were more likely to engage in unpredictable criminal acts. Each person in this group was placed on the direct checklist. However, most had alibis or their trucks were not in the area at the time. As the list narrowed, the team reached the final group: owners who had moved to the area within the past 6 months, 10 individuals total. Among them was one name that initially drew no special attention: Raymond Pierce, age 37, living approximately 2.3 miles from the scene. DMV records showed his vehicle as a green Ford F-100, validly registered with no ownership changes in the past 3 years. His residence was a small rented house in an ordinary neighborhood with no noted reports of unusual behavior. More importantly, a criminal record check showed Raymond had no prior convictions and no significant violations beyond a traffic ticket 2 years earlier. This caused his name to be flagged as low priority. Among the supplemental suspects to be checked, Raymond ranked 8th, categorized as low probability, because the absence of a criminal record or documented abnormal behavior did not meet the 1972 investigation team's prioritization criteria. Additionally, Raymond worked at a farm equipment repair shop about 30 minutes from Roanoke, and according to the shop owner, he habitually arrived early and left late, leading investigators to conclude it was unlikely he would be in the residential area near the school that morning. Although his exact timeline had not yet been fully verified, the internal report noted the likelihood of his involvement as low based on his clean record and apparently stable lifestyle. Of the 7 highest priority suspects, only 3 still lacked confirmed alibis on the first day, but none of them owned a truck that fully matched witness descriptions. The investigation team temporarily focused on these cases while continuing to verify the remaining vehicles on the list of 79. The commander approved the classification report with the conclusion that no subject stood out clearly, but the green truck remained the central investigative focus. The fact that Raymond Pierce was not placed in the priority group did not stem from any specific piece of evidence, but from the suspect classification procedures of that era, which relied heavily on criminal history and unstable behavior, criteria Raymond did not meet. As a result, he was simply marked as a case to check when time allowed, and his file was placed at the bottom of the list and not examined immediately, even though his vehicle matched the description more closely than many others. This meant that verification of Raymond's truck was not conducted on the first day, and the investigation shifted focus to owners initially assessed as higher risk. After completing the suspect list based on green Ford owners and finding no standout subject, Roanoke PD shifted emphasis to a physical search of the neighborhood to collect any trace evidence that could support the investigation. The search was organized according to the standard structure of the period. Group 1 covered the area around the Long residence and adjacent walkways. Group 2 swept the route Matthew walked to school. Group 3 covered alleys, backyards, parking areas, and potential temporary hiding spots. Group 4 checked the wider area, including secluded corners, vacant houses, and businesses on the edge of the neighborhood. The temporary command post set up a neighborhood map on the hood of a patrol car, divided zones with grease pencil, and assigned each group a clockwise route to avoid overlap. The time from when Matthew left home until police arrived on scene was estimated at about 1 hour, so the top priority was searching small enclosed spaces where a child could be held briefly. Group 1, responsible for the area around the longhouse, began checking fences, bushes next to the porch, the garage, tool sheds, and the entire backyard. No signs were found indicating Matthew had returned or turned into this area. They also searched the lots behind the immediate neighbors, the Henderson and Lutz homes, which contained many garden items that would easily topple or leave marks if a child passed through. A few small footprints were visible in damp soil behind the Henderson house, but the neighbor confirmed they belonged to her grandson from the previous day and were deemed unrelated. Group 2, covering the route to school, examined every curb from the longhouse to the intersection, the path Matthew took daily. They closely inspected grass sections and soft ground and collected anything that could have been dropped. About 15 minutes after starting, one officer discovered a small drawing paper about 30 meters from the longhouse lying near the base of an oak tree beside the road. The paper was identified as coming from the notebook Matthew usually carried. It was folded in half with slightly soiled edges as if stepped on. The item was marked, placed in an evidence bag, and the discovery time recorded. Although it could not be confirmed whether Matthew dropped it before or during the disappearance, police treated it as evidence that he had followed his usual route. Group 2 continued to the intersection, searching within a 20-meter radius of the spot David had indicated. Another officer found a small broken pencil stub lying at the edge of the grass. Evelyn later confirmed Matthew had carried pencils, but could not say for certain it was his, since elementary students often dropped pencils in the area. Nevertheless, The item was collected for later examination. Group 3, responsible for side alleys and backyards near the intersection, played a key role in looking for signs that a stranger might have stopped or approached a child without being noticed. They checked narrow yards between houses, paths behind garages, and large trash cans that had been pulled to the curb that morning. One officer noticed a small skid mark in soft dirt near the northern alley entrance, but no related items were found. The mark was too faint to determine direction or foot size and was simply noted. Group 3 also searched behind an abandoned plumbing shop about 4 houses from the intersection. The building had a rear door ajar due to a broken hinge, but inside the team found nothing unusual beyond old equipment. Group 4, operating farther out, checked the parking lot behind a small grocery store and the road leading to a sparsely wooded area. There, an officer found a discarded menthol cigarette pack near the fence. Because many local men smoked, the item was not considered significant and was not collected as primary evidence. However, it was marked on the map because it lay along a possible egress route for the green truck. All search groups reported every 10 minutes so command could adjust coverage. The neighborhood canvass revealed no indication that Matthew had voluntarily turned into any yard or headed toward the nearby woods. The discovered drawing paper was evaluated as the only physical evidence directly linked to Matthew at this stage. Based on collected data, the temporary command post updated the scene map, marking evidence locations, redrawing suspected footprint areas, adding points where witnesses saw the green truck, and noting completed search routes to prevent duplication. The neighborhood search yielded no clear evidence of Matthew's direction after the disappearance, but helped rule out the possibility that he was being held near the house or in nearby backyards. This gradually shifted the search focus outward from the immediate area, especially toward routes a vehicle could have taken in the first minutes after Matthew vanished. After completing the sweep of the residential neighborhood without finding any traces that could determine Matthew's direction of movement, the on-scene command team shifted the search focus to the Mill Mountain Forest, an extensive area with complex terrain, located less than half a mile as the crow flies from the intersection where the boy disappeared. With its steep hills, intersecting trails, and dense underbrush, this was a location that could conceal the short-term activity of a vehicle or a stranger without detection. According to procedure at the time, searching the forested area required forming a specialized search team separate from the units still canvassing the neighborhood. The sheriff immediately deployed a team consisting of 8 officers, 2 firefighters to assist with terrain access, and 4 local volunteers familiar with the hiking trails around Mill Mountain. A topographic map was spread across the hood of a patrol car marked the intersection where Matthew vanished, the forest's main trails, and the estimated distances from the scene to each spur road. The search priorities were set, the trails leading uphill to the west, the secondary route descending to the Dry Creek area, and a dirt access road commonly used by city lawn care pickup trucks. The search team was divided into 3 groups. Metis Group 1 handled the main trail entering the forest from the intersection side. Group 2 swept the dirt road capable of admitting vehicles. Group 3 checked the thick vegetation along the creek and the low-lying depressions that were easy to miss. Each group carried portable radios, small flashlights, probing sticks, and cloth marking tape to flag checked locations. Mill Mountain's terrain contains many open clearings, wide grassy patches between clusters of large trees, often used by residents to walk dogs or for children to play. These open areas were prioritized because if Matthew had wandered off or been taken into the woods, he was far more likely to be visible in those clear zones. Approaching the main trail, Group 1 moved in single-file formation, 2 officers in front breaking trail, followed by the 4 volunteers noting the path and any anomalies. The trail into the woods was well defined, showing adult and children's footprints from previous days, but no signs of stumbling or dropped items. After roughly 150 meters, they reached a small clearing where the trees thinned and the leaf-covered ground allowed clearer footprint observation. One officer noticed an unusual compression mark, possibly caused by something heavy pressing down, but it was not deep enough to distinguish between a vehicle or a person. The mark was flagged with colored cloth tape for later re-examination. To the east of the search grid, Group 2 advanced along the seldom-used dirt road. This was the only route that could allow an older pickup truck to enter the forest relatively quietly, as the hard-packed surface would not produce deep ruts. The team moved slowly, examining tire tracks, but found only old, indistinguishable marks. They logged the location and wear pattern of each track, but saw no clear match to the witness descriptions. After penetrating about 200 meters deeper into the woods, the team reached a larger clearing frequently used for illegal camping. The ground there contained numerous cigarette butts, rolling papers, and footprints from various times. Among them, a small crumpled piece of menthol cigarette foil wrapper caught attention. However, at the time the search team did not consider it directly relevant because menthol cigarettes were extremely common and the area had long been a known smoking and hangout spot. The foil was noted in the terrain report, but not collected as material evidence. Group 3, assigned to the dry creek bed, faced the densest vegetation. They used probing sticks to avoid sinkholes while checking every tree hollow and rock crevice. In a damp patch near the creek bank, they found a small shoe print, but the edges were blurred by overnight dew. Although the size could match a child's shoe, erosion and overlapping animal tracks made it impossible to date or link to Matthew. The print was sketched in a notebook, but was not clear enough to be treated as a primary lead. When all three groups completed their initial sweep and returned, Command consolidated the findings. No direct physical evidence linked to Matthew was recovered, but several points were flagged for follow-up. The compression mark in the clearing, the blurred shoe print near the creek, multiple old tire tracks on the dirt road, and the presence of menthol foil in an area not typically busy in the morning. One officer raised the possibility that the driver of the green truck smoked that brand, based on David's statement that the man in the truck was smoking. However, Command did not place weight on this theory, partly because the foil's timing could not be established, and partly because the location was already littered with prior smoking debris. The absence of solid evidence meant the search would expand, rather than fixate on any single uncertain clue. The forest search lasted over 2 hours across the sprawling terrain. Upon returning to the staging area, all groups confirmed no indication Matthew had gone deep into the woods or been held within the initial search radius. Nevertheless, the collected data supported the conclusion that if a vehicle had entered the forest that morning, it most likely used the western dirt access road, the only route wide enough for a pickup truck to travel deeper into Mill Mountain without drawing attention. The search map was fully annotated with checked zones and locations of potential traces. Although no direct evidence was found, the report concluded that Mill Mountain contained many areas still unsearchable that morning due to its size, and the forest would remain a priority area in subsequent search phases. When the Mill Mountain forest teams returned to the staging without definitive traces, on-scene command shifted to analyzing the likelihood that the vehicle had fled the immediate area within the first few minutes after Matthew's disappearance. The goal was to model the possible movement of the green Ford pickup based on timeline, witness sightings, morning traffic patterns, and roads accessible from the intersection. The lead investigator requested the Roanoke street map be opened, marking the incident intersection as ground zero, then using time radius rings to determine how far the truck could travel in the first 2, 5, and 10 minutes. For an older pickup, average speed when leaving a residential area was estimated at 15-25 miles per hour, depending on vehicle condition and traffic. The technical team drew 3 time arcs on the map. The 2-minute arc covered the surrounding neighborhood and part of the forest entrance. The 5-minute arc reached 3 major roads. The 10-minute arc could take the truck out of the city limits and close to highway on ramps. From there, analysts identified the 3 most probable escape directions based on street layout and witness statements. Direction 1. Turn left from the intersection onto the main road leading directly to the minor highway connecting Roanoke to southern areas. This was the fastest route, allowing the truck to clear the neighborhood in roughly 2 minutes and blend into morning traffic. The disadvantage was the large number of homes facing the road. If the truck took this route between 9 o'clock and 9:05 a.m., the odds of being seen were high, yet only one preliminary witness reported a vehicle heading downhill insufficient for confirmation. Direction 2. Turn right, deeper into the residential area, abutting the forest, connecting to the dirt road into Mill Mountain. This route had little morning traffic and many sightline obstructions, ideal if the driver wished to avoid observation. However, the rear dirt road was only logical for entering the woods or temporary concealment, not for immediate city exit. The discovery of multiple old tire tracks and the menthol foil in the clearing showed the route had been used in the past, but there was no data tying it to that specific morning. The only witness describing this direction was Mr. Lutz, who saw the green truck the previous afternoon heading south toward the forest edge, data that did not match the incident timeline and therefore could not serve as direct evidence. Direction 3. Continue straight down the hill toward the Roanoke suburbs, where the narrow road split into 2 secondary branches that could loop around the city. This was the least trafficked route, yet allowed escape via a circuitous path, avoiding busy intersections. The downside was the steep grade and heavy tree cover. Rapid acceleration would create noticeable engine noise, though morning traffic noise from the nearby main road could mask it. One cyclist's statement about seeing the truck take off quickly from the intersection aligned with a straight-ahead departure, but she could not observe accurately while riding. When witness statements were overlaid on the 3 directional models, each route showed both supporting and uncertain elements. The left turn offered the highest speed of escape, but lacked any witness confirming the truck took it at the exact moment Matthew vanished. The right turn matched the terrain data and the truck's repeated prior presence, but lacked evidence. The driver had reason to enter the woods at that precise time. The straight-ahead path fit the timeline and the cyclist's statement, but offered limited sightlines for verification. Analysts further calculated that only 30 seconds to 1 minute elapsed between Matthew being last seen and the truck's possible departure from the intersection, suggesting the driver may have pre-observed the situation and waited for the right moment. Yet all 3 directions remained within the possible distance traveled in that window, preventing investigators from isolating the primary route. The possibility the truck paused nearby for several minutes before leaving was considered, but no witness reported seeing it parked after 9 a.m. After compiling all data, the analytical team concluded there was insufficient information to determine the green truck's dominant direction of travel, and all 3 routes must be treated as equally viable. This forced police to spread resources more thinly across road checks and expand the overall search perimeter. The inability to fix the direction also highlighted how the critical first 10 minutes after Matthew's disappearance created numerous variables that severely complicated vehicle tracking. The lead investigator noted clearly in the report, "No escape route possesses stronger grounding than the others. Every route must be investigated on equal footing until additional data emerges." While the analytical team was still unable to establish the green truck's primary direction, investigators continued examining peripheral data sources in the area, including the possibility that images of the vehicle at the time of Matthew's disappearance existed. Because 1972 had virtually no public surveillance cameras, the only potential visual record was from the earliest ATM machines installed at some local banks. An officer reported that approximately 4 blocks from the disappearance intersection stood an ATM belonging to Roanoke Savings Bank, positioned at a main road corner, whose lens could cover part of the stretch. The green truck would very likely travel if it turned left or continued straight downhill. Although 1970's ATM camera resolution was extremely limited and recorded only still frames every few seconds, it remained one of the very few sources capable of capturing vehicle movement within the incident timeframe. 2 officers were immediately dispatched to the bank to request the morning's recording. Upon arrival, They learned the ATM camera recorded continuously onto magnetic tape that retained data for only about 48-72 hours, depending on usage. The police reached the bank near the end of the third day after the disappearance, meaning the tape had been in the machine for over 60 hours. The maintenance technician explained that the tape did not separate data by date. It simply looped and overwrote itself when it reached the end. Because this ATM had medium to high morning and afternoon transaction volume, the tape typically overwrote itself after roughly 2.5 days, sometimes sooner. When the technician opened the recorder, investigators discovered the segment containing 9 o'clock, 9:10 a.m. on the day of the incident had been completely overwritten by the following day's transactions. Only images from the previous afternoon and the mornings of the 2 subsequent days remained, none of which held value for Matthew's search. One officer quickly reviewed the remaining footage for any prior sightings of the green truck, but the ATM camera pointed directly at the user, capturing only a tiny edge of the street. No vehicle matching the description appeared in the surviving frames, nor was the truck recorded near the bank at any other time that day. Failure to secure the tape in time created a critical gap in the investigation. Had the recording been preserved, even if blurry or partially obstructed, it could have confirmed the truck's direction, exact departure time, or provided details of the body tailgate or bed edges, features witness descriptions had not fully clarified. The investigative team documented this error in the report. The interval between receiving the missing child call and checking the ATM camera exceeded the window required to preserve the data. However, in the context of 1972, when no dedicated image review unit existed, such delay reflected the era's overall limitations in evidence handling protocol. When the report reached headquarters, the lead investigator noted explicitly that the opportunity for visual verification was lost forever. This not only made determining the green truck's direction more difficult, but also reduced the chances of obtaining a license plate or mechanical details that could have narrowed the list of 79 registered vehicles then under review. The final outcome of the ATM camera check was recorded as no useful data obtained, and the absence of photographic evidence forced investigators to continue relying solely on witness statements and route analysis to establish the suspect vehicle's path. Within 48 hours of Matthew being reported missing, Roanoke PD completed the compilation of all data collected from search teams, the analysis unit, and witnesses in order to assess the case's progress and determine the next courses of action. The status summary showed that all efforts during the first 2 days, considered the most critical period in any child disappearance, had still not produced any leads capable of confirming Matthew's direction of movement or that of the suspected green truck. The recorded information included the location where Matthew was last seen at the intersection near his home, David's statement about the green Ford F-100, witnesses seeing the truck in the area on multiple days prior, and dropped items such as the drawing paper and the broken pencil piece. However, each clue remained isolated, unable to be linked together in a logical sequence to determine the actions of the victim or the suspect. The physical evidence collected was not conclusive due to the absence of external tampering signs or the inability to authenticate the time it was dropped. Canvassing the neighborhood revealed no indication that Matthew had voluntarily turned into any driveway or side path. Searches in Mill Mountain uncovered no direct evidence, only some faint traces, and a menthol cigarette foil wrapper of undetermined age. Regarding vehicle direction, the analysis team modeled 3 possible exits from the intersection: turning left onto the minor highway, turning right onto the dirt road leading into the woods, or continuing straight downhill toward the suburbs. But none of the models had sufficient data to be considered the primary route. The fact that no witness saw Matthew after the moment he approached the location of the green truck was the most concerning factor, as it indicated an information gap stretching from the first minute after he was lost from sight until search teams began surveying the area. This gap became the biggest obstacle to the entire analysis process and was flagged in red in the summary as time gap critical. Checking the ATM camera, virtually the only opportunity that could have provided footage, failed because the data had been overwritten before police could retrieve it. The investigation team stated frankly that the loss of video evidence eliminated one of the very few real-time verification possibilities, leaving root analysis of the vehicle entirely dependent on scattered witness statements. The 48-hour report also re-evaluated the list of suspected green Ford owners. Out of 79 vehicles, only about 30 had been physically checked in the first 2 days. The remainder could not be verified because owners were working out of town, away from home, or the vehicles were outside the area. None of the priority list suspects showed any direct connection to the scene. Raymond Pierce, one of the owners whose vehicle most closely matched the description, remained at the bottom of the checklist because he had no prior record and, according to initial files, a stable residence history. This was explicitly noted in the report as an example of how suspect prioritization at the time relied more heavily on behavioral indicators and criminal history than on the degree of vehicle match. In the progress assessment section, the lead investigator noted that the current volume of leads was insufficient to accurately reconstruct the suspected vehicle's direction of travel or determine which way Matthew left the area. There was no verified evidence that the boy had run away on his own, and even less indication he had been held within the neighborhood. Search teams had covered every location a child could hide or be taken in a short time frame, yet no signs of life were found. All available data pointed to the conclusion that if Matthew had been taken by vehicle, the truck left the area before police arrived on scene. The preliminary report therefore concluded that the scope of the investigation could no longer be limited to the city of Roanoke. The chief of police reviewed the full data compilation and agreed that the possibility the green truck had left the city was entirely plausible and had likely occurred within the first 5–10 minutes. Roanoke's terrain, with its numerous side roads, narrow slopes, and network of back routes, allowed a vehicle to exit the neighborhood without passing through busy intersections. More importantly, no witness reported seeing the truck remain in the area after 9:05 a.m., strongly suggesting the vehicle had already left the initial search perimeter before patrol units were deployed. At the end of the summary, the chief of police made the formal recommendation: expand the investigative radius beyond the Roanoke city limits, including coordination with neighboring towns and highways leading to outlying areas. This decision was marked immediate action required, directing the investigation team to shift from neighborhood searches to collecting data from long-distance routes, gas stations, roadside stores, and truck stop locations. Because the exact vehicle direction could still not be determined, the expanded scope would cover all 3 possible routes. The 48-hour summary concluded that although no confirmed leads had been found, the case must continue to be treated at the highest risk level, and every subsequent step must focus on the likelihood that Matthew had been removed from the city in the extremely short window immediately following his disappearance. Once the decision to expand the investigation beyond inner-city Roanoke was approved, the investigation team's next step was to screen every man living alone within the relevant radius, a standard procedure in child disappearances when no suspect or motive has been identified. The goal was to locate individuals with unstable residence histories, unusual activity patterns, or who had moved to the area shortly before the incident. The Data Analysis Unit compiled the list from census records, tax files, and reports from routine neighborhood police checks. Because 1972 records were not digitized, compilation had to be done manually, reviewing each paper file, cross-referencing current addresses, and verifying information by directly contacting landlords, homeowners, or neighbors. After 6 hours of work, the resulting list contained 43 men living alone within a 3-mile radius of where Matthew disappeared. The list included various categories: seasonal workers, temporary laborers, long-term room renters with little neighbor contact, returning veterans, and some with no steady employment. The investigation team categorized them into 3 priority levels based on behavioral factors and residence history. High priority included those previously reported for disturbances, unusual behavior, or suspected in minor incidents. Medium priority covered those who had moved to the area within the past 6 months. Low priority consisted of long-term residents with steady jobs and no instability reports. Cross-referencing residents' history was critical to identifying individuals who had appeared in the area shortly before Matthew's disappearance. The team focused on anyone who moved in during the previous 6 months, as statistics showed that in non-motivated abductions, many offenders frequently moved between small towns. Of the 43 individuals, 11 were recent arrivals, most of them manual laborers or contract workers employed at machine shops or construction sites. When this list was cross-checked against the green Ford owners list, only one name appeared on both: Raymond Pierce, who rented a small house in a residential area just over 2 miles from the scene. However, because prioritization was based on criminal record and reports of unstable behavior, Raymond was not placed in the high-priority group. His residence file showed he had moved to the area in early summer of that year, had a valid lease, and worked full-time at a farm equipment repair shop. Background checks revealed no prior convictions, no record of incidents, and no reports of unusual behavior. Neighbors in his area described him as quiet, regular in his work hours, home on time, and never noisy. All of these factors resulted in him being classified as low priority, despite owning a vehicle that matched the witness description better than any other case on the list. Meanwhile, the higher priority cases received closer scrutiny. A 52-year-old man previously reported for watching children in a park, a room renter with a history of drunken disturbances, and a seasonal worker who frequently changed addresses. Each high-priority individual was placed on the rapid interview list, while medium-priority cases were scheduled for welfare checks at different times of day to verify routines. However, when teams made contact, most had clear alibis. Some were confirmed at morning shifts by coworkers, others were far from the area at the time, and some did not even own a vehicle. The investigation team noted that although the single male resident list was fairly comprehensive, the lack of detailed behavioral data made accurate prioritization difficult. Raymond Pierce, with a clean record and stable described behavior, continued to carry no red flag. The absence of any past red flags caused investigators not to regard him as a person of interest, even though his truck matched the suspect vehicle description more closely than any other on the list. The final screening report stated that failing to identify any clear red flags among single male residents meant the suspect pool could not be narrowed based on residence factors alone. All 43 cases still required some level of follow-up, but none stood out as directly linked to the disappearance, and the screening process produced no breakthrough in connecting scene evidence to a specific suspect. While the investigation team was screening the single male resident list without finding a standout suspect, a report came in from Western Roanoke to the command center stating that a local resident had seen a dark green Ford pickup traveling fast on Old Mill Road toward the Appalachian foothills, approximately 15-20 minutes after Matthew disappeared. The witness was Henry Cole, a freelance mechanic who lived near the ridge and was very familiar with late 1960s and early 1970s vehicle models. He was certain the truck he saw was an older Ford, dark green with slightly faded paint and an empty bed. Details that matched the description given by witnesses in the neighborhood where Matthew vanished. Even more significant, Mr. Cole reported the engine sounded uneven and rough, and he smelled menthol cigarette smoke as the truck passed, matching David's description of the driver smoking inside the cab. The report was immediately forwarded to the analysis team, but because it was received more than 2 hours after the disappearance, command assessed that verifying whether Mr. Cole's truck was the same vehicle involved with Matthew was extremely difficult. Additionally, the Old Mill Road area borders routes leading into the lower mountains, where older work trucks, construction vehicles, and farm trucks regularly travel, making it hard to deem the sighting unusual. Nevertheless, per standard protocol in child disappearances, any vehicle sighting that matches the description within the relevant time window must be followed up by establishing roadblocks on escape routes. For the western direction, at least 3 checkpoints could have been set up quickly. the intersection leading to the Blue Ridge Spur Mountain Road, the loop past the small industrial area, and the turnoff into the lower Appalachia woodland. However, with manpower already spread thin across neighborhood searches, Mill Mountain forest sweeps, witness interviews, and suspect list processing, the on-scene command determined there were not enough officers to add western checkpoints while maintaining effective inner-area searches. Another key reason the roadblock procedure was not executed was the assessment of the statement's reliability. Cole's report was received by telephone, contained no license plate description, no confirmation of how many occupants were in the truck, and no information on whether the vehicle stopped or continued deeper into the Appalachia region. Faced with dozens of similarly vague tips from other residents, Command classified Mr. Cole's report as potentially useful but lacking foundation and therefore lower priority than ongoing tasks at the disappearance scene. The failure to establish checkpoints immediately allowed the critical window for confirming the truck's direction to close rapidly. Later reports noted that if the green truck did turn west, it could have left the Roanoke area in under 8 minutes, entering the network of small mountain roads deep in the Appalachians, where police tracking is difficult and effective roadblocks nearly impossible due to complex terrain and numerous side routes. At an average speed of 20-25 miles per hour on empty roads, any vehicle could travel deep into the forest or turn onto secondary paths before police could mobilize. Every passing minute dramatically reduced the chance of picking up the trail, especially in an area routinely traveled by construction and farm trucks that look similar to the suspect vehicle. When investigators reviewed all data at the end of the second day, they realized the western direction was the only one with an independent sighting that matched the suspect truck description at a time closest to Matthews' disappearance. However, because no checkpoints were established, no vehicles were stopped on that route, and no additional reports came from mountain area residents, the western route became the only direction the investigation could neither confirm nor rule out. In the internal summary, the lead investigator noted that the decision not to set up western checkpoints constituted a significant tactical miss, although no one could say with certainty it would have changed the outcome. Still, the fact that it was the only lead pointing outside Roanoke city limits at a time closest to the incident made it simultaneously the most promising investigative direction and the one permanently lost due to lack of timely pursuit. In the Appalachia section conclusion, the investigation team clearly stated the western direction cannot be further evaluated due to absence of primary data and failure to establish roadblocks within the required timeframe. The lead regarding the green truck in that sector is officially deemed non-recoverable. Within 3 months of Matthews' disappearance, the Roanoke Police Department compiled every piece of data collected from searches, tip calls, witness statements, vehicle canvasses, residence checks, and scattered other signals from residents inside and outside the city. Once classification was complete, the total number of officially recorded leads reached 212 items, including 68 reports of suspicious vehicles, 41 direct witness statements related to children or strangers appearing in the area, 29 tips from nearby towns, and 74 miscellaneous smaller pieces of information, such as dropped objects, compressed soil marks, unusual sounds, or unconfirmed sightings. However, when the investigative team analyzed each lead by priority level, none produced a meaningful breakthrough. The vehicle reports mostly came from people who had seen different shades of green pickup trucks at various times, the majority of which did not match the timeline or the specific description of the suspect vehicle. Some reported seeing a truck speeding through residential areas, but most led to legally registered owners, construction vehicles, or trucks that did not match the paint color and headlight characteristics. Witness statements about strangers hanging around the school area in the 3 weeks prior were also compiled, but none came close enough to the man David had seen in the truck. Except for the detail of smoking, which was far too common to serve as an identifying marker. Physical leads, such as the drawing paper and the broken pencil stub, yielded nothing new after examination because there were no signs of external tampering or they were simply children's items dropped along a familiar route. The faint shoe prints along the creek in the Mill Mountain forest could not be dated or linked because they were overlaid by animal tracks and running water, while the compressed earth patches and open areas were not clear enough to analyze direction of travel. Reports of unusual sounds that morning, including a vehicle speeding, a door slamming hard, or an engine revving quickly, were logged but were not specific enough to pin down time or location. Tips from neighboring towns, including reports of a lost child or a middle-aged man walking with a small boy, were all checked and confirmed unrelated. In some locations, local police located children matching the description, but every case turned out to be a child who had wandered too far while playing or become separated from parents. None showed signs of abduction. Beyond the random reports, the investigative team received a total of 12 anonymous calls, most of which were baseless or speculative, such as saw a strange truck heading toward the mountains, heard someone rented a cheap room out west, or someone heard a child crying in an abandoned warehouse. Checking each of those locations produced no results. The team also canvassed 79 owners of green Ford trucks listed with the DMV. 64 were fully alibied, 12 were unrelated, and 3 were still pending confirmation, but showed no red flags. Within that group, Raymond Pierce's vehicle had not yet been directly inspected, but because of his stable residence history and clean record, he remained low priority. The 3-month summary report made one thing clear: there was no connected chain of leads, no direct physical evidence, and no standout suspect on which to focus. The lack of solid data meant the entire effort remained broad and unfocused, with no breakthrough. Faced with this situation, Roanoke PD submitted a request for assistance to the FBI to consider federal involvement. The FBI, however, responded that the case did not yet meet the criteria for a federal crime because there was no evidence of kidnapping, no interstate connection, no ransom demand, and no proof Matthew had been taken across state lines. Under the standards of that era, the FBI could only join if there was clear evidence of abduction or interstate transportation, both of which were completely absent here. The request was therefore denied. In the final assessment section, the chief of police noted that despite maximum mobilization of resources in the first 3 months, the scope of the investigation was too vast and the data too fragmented for the case to move forward. He marked the case as no clear investigative leads and directed the focus to shift to passive monitoring, continuing to receive and process any new information that appeared while keeping the file open, but with no active investigative prongs. The 3-month report closed with the observation that the investigation had reached the limit of what local lead gathering could achieve, and that no development was strong enough to push the case into the next phase. By early 1974, after more than 18 months with no significant progress, Roanoke PD completed a full case review and officially moved Matthew Long's disappearance into cold case status, a category reserved for cases that no longer had sufficient basis for active investigation but remained open in case new information surfaced. The decision was made after a meeting among the police chief, the original investigative team, and a representative from the local prosecutor's office. All agreed that every available lead had been exhausted. The 212 scattered reports had been processed. Nearly all 79 green Ford trucks had been checked. The list of people living alone had been reviewed per procedure, and more than a dozen potential exit routes from Roanoke had been noted but could not be verified. There had been no new data for many months, no additional witnesses, no reports of unusual vehicles near the incident area, and no matching physical evidence or traces found in the final Mill Mountain searches. In the internal memo, the lead detective wrote plainly, "No further viable investigative avenues can be pursued within current resources." Once the case was officially downgraded to cold case, the entire file was moved out of the active investigation room and placed into long-term storage. A small unit within the department retained the task of passive monitoring, meaning they would accept new reports, conduct preliminary checks on anything that looked promising, and update the file if something worthwhile was discovered. However, there was no longer a dedicated full-time team assigned to the case. New tips would only be handled as they came in, and each report would be evaluated against the 1972 data for relevance. In reality, in the first year after the case went cold, only 4 tips were received, all quickly verified as unrelated. One was a boy who got lost in the town of Salem and was thought to resemble Matthew, but photo comparison and timeline checks proved otherwise. Another was a report of a middle-aged man with a smaller-than-average child at a gas station near the Appalachians, but the station attendant confirmed it was a local father and son. The remaining 2 were vague reports from people claiming they heard something or suspected something, but provided no verifiable details, leaving police nothing to pursue. Moving the case to cold status created a clear void in investigative activity because no additional resources were allocated for deeper searching. In the spring of 1974, Roanoke PD was dealing with a wave of property thefts and several other serious cases, making it harder to keep personnel assigned to long-term missing persons files. For most similar cases of that era, when there was no clear evidence or motive, files were easily shifted to passive status so resources could be redirected to cases with higher solvability. For the Long family, however, the case becoming cold did not mean the search was over. On the contrary, this period marked a shift from relying on the official investigation to the family's own independent efforts. Thomas and Evelyn continued posting Matthew's picture in local supermarkets, used a typewriter to print their own missing child flyers, and distributed them door-to-door in neighborhoods. They mailed letters to churches, schools, and government offices in surrounding towns, hoping for responses or new leads. David, though still young, clearly remembered the image of his little brother turning the corner that morning, and it drove him to join every search activity with his parents. The whole family repeatedly went to Mill Mountain themselves, walking trails the police had skipped due to lack of manpower. Yet all of these efforts yielded no discoveries. They even hired a private investigator for 3 months. But after re-canvassing the entire neighborhood and re-interviewing some of the original witnesses, the PI concluded there was no angle in the case that offered a fresh investigative direction. Every year, on the anniversary of Matthew's disappearance, the family held a small prayer service at the local church in hopes of jogging someone's memory. Over time, however, community memory faded, and many early witnesses had moved away or no longer recalled details clearly. The lack of new information from police left the Long family in a constant state of waiting for a phone call, a letter, any sign that Matthew was still out there somewhere. But the first months after the case went cold passed in silence. Throughout this period, the only things that remained were the family's fragile hope and a thick file of disconnected information sitting on a storage shelf, with no clear investigative thread left to pull. Roughly 6 months after the Matthew Long case was moved to cold status and active investigation in Roanoke had effectively stopped, Raymond Pierce, the man who had been on the police's low-priority suspect list but never directly checked, quietly left Virginia and moved to Beckley, a small town in southern West Virginia. His departure from Roanoke attracted no attention because his residence record was clean, there were no reports of unusual behavior, and no law enforcement agency was tracking his movements. According to later discovered rental records in Beckley, Raymond signed a lease for a small wooden house set far back on a little-traveled forest road on the outskirts of town. The house was big enough for 2, with a kitchen, living room, and 2 small bedrooms, separated from other homes by hundreds of yards of sparse woods. The landlord noted that Raymond arrived with a boy around 6 or 7 years old, introduced as his son from a previous marriage, named Evan Pierce. Because there was no interstate residency data sharing system at the time, no one had reason to question the story. The process of formalizing Matthew's new identity took place over the few weeks after Raymond settled in Beckley. Raymond went to the county office to request a replacement birth certificate, claiming the original papers had been lost during the move. With the administrative system in 1974 still heavily paper-based and local, such requests were not unusual. The county clerk asked Raymond to provide the boy's name, estimated date of birth, and parents' names, information he could easily fabricate without cross-checking any central database. A temporary birth certificate in the name of Evan Pierce was issued using the standard form of the day, a handwritten record stating the child was born at home in rural West Virginia, not registered on time. A common situation for lower-income families. The clerk approved it without further questions. Once he had the birth certificate, Raymond completed the rest of Evan's identification paperwork, including enrollment at the local elementary school. On the enrollment forms, Raymond stated that Evan had never attended school before due to family hardship. That explanation made the absence of prior school records, vaccination proof, or original documents unremarkable. The school accepted the paperwork and simply asked the parent to take the boy for routine health checks to catch up on missing vaccinations. Raymond chose a small private clinic that only required a verbal confirmation of the child's medical history. Since there was no mandatory identification number system like today, attaching a brand new identity to a child with no documented past was entirely feasible. The local Beckley community accepted Evan as a shy, quiet boy who lived with his father in the secluded house near the woods. Neighbors described Raymond as someone who went to work regularly, was polite, caused no trouble, and occasionally brought Evan along when grocery shopping. No one suspected anything unusual about their relationship. In that era, a widowed or divorced man raising a child alone was not rare, and since Raymond always paid rent on time and kept to himself, no one felt the need to ask questions. More importantly, because there was no interstate missing child alert system, which would only come decades later with Amber Alert, the information about Matthew Long's disappearance never reached administrative offices or schools in West Virginia. Data sharing between states essentially did not exist. Roanoke PD only circulated the case internally within Virginia, and Matthew's missing person file appeared only in local bulletins near Roanoke, never farther afield. This allowed Raymond to take Matthew across state lines without leaving any administrative trace. No police were notified, no documents were flagged, and no federal agency was watching. When Raymond and Matthew, now under the name Evan, settled into the rhythm of life in a small Appalachian town, they became part of a new community with no suspicion or scrutiny whatsoever. The entire process of moving, registering residency, and legalizing the new identity went so smoothly that it raised no red flags and generated no signals that could ever trace back to Roanoke. From an investigative standpoint, Raymond's quiet departure from Virginia, combined with the complete absence of interstate data sharing and alert procedures, severed any chance of locating Matthew while the trail was still fresh. While the case file gathered dust in Roanoke PD storage, Matthew, under the name Evan Pierce, began an entirely different life in Beckley, with no one around him aware that the boy's true identity did not belong there at all. Once his life had stabilized in Beckley under a new identity, Matthew, now carrying the name Evan Pierce, as created by the birth certificate Raymond had fabricated, entered a childhood phase completely detached from his true origins. The town of Beckley in the mid-1970s was a small community where most residents worked in coal mines, machine shops, or local services, a place where children freely ran and played around the neighborhood, and adults knew each other through daily routines. In that environment, the arrival of Raymond and a new boy who had just moved in raised no suspicion whatsoever. Evan was introduced as a shy child who had previously lived in a rural area and hadn't had the opportunity to attend school regularly before his father relocated. This story perfectly matched the reality of many working-class families across Appalachia at the time. When Raymond took Evan to enroll at Woodland Elementary School, the boy's records were not scrutinized closely. The enrollment staff only required a birth certificate and a health verification from a private clinic, both of which Raymond had fully prepared. Since Beckley had no data connection with Virginia and there was no national database to cross-reference missing children, the fact that Evan had never appeared in the education system before raised no red flags. His file was approved immediately, even noted as new student transferred from a mountainous area, a common and unremarkable description. In the classroom, Evan quickly became part of the school routine despite carrying no clear memories of any prior educational environment. The boy spoke little, usually sat in the back row and listened more than he interacted. His homeroom teacher observed that Evan concentrated well, but was somewhat withdrawn, especially during group discussions. Some classmates were curious that he never talked about his family or old friends, but Evan's quiet personality caused those questions to fade away. No one, not even the teachers, raised any doubts, because all the paperwork was valid and because Evan's demeanor matched that of many local children from complicated family backgrounds. Outside school, he gradually adapted to the slow-paced life of the town. Raymond took Evan shopping at the grocery store in downtown Beckley every weekend, and sometimes brought him along to the repair shop where he worked. In those places, Raymond maintained only minimal social contact, greeting people just enough, paying on time, and never causing trouble. He didn't let Evan out of his sight during the first few months, but as time passed and he saw that no one was asking questions, he allowed the boy to walk to school alone or play in the yard. Still, Evan's freedom remained tightly controlled by Raymond. He was not allowed to go deep into the woods behind the house by himself, not permitted to visit friends' homes without prior notice, and forbidden to mention anything from before Beckley. These restrictions were disguised as the concerns of a single father worried about his son, and neighbors saw nothing unusual. A key factor that allowed Evan to blend in seamlessly was the way the administrative and educational systems operated at the time. There was no identification technology, no synchronized interstate databases, and no requirement to verify prior academic history or identity credentials. A valid birth certificate and a health certificate were enough for a child to completely recreate an identity. The private clinic recorded Evan's name exactly as Raymond provided without keeping electronic records. Everything was handwritten, filed in cabinets, and rarely re-examined. This made cross-checking Evan's background practically impossible, even if someone had asked, but no one did. Neighbors occasionally noticed that Evan rarely smiled or engaged in the rough-and-tumble play typical of kids his age, but they simply thought he was quiet like his dad. Raymond also discouraged too much socializing. He kept clear boundaries with the community and prevented Evan from forming deep friendships with any family, which unintentionally reduced the chance that anyone would notice anything odd about the boy's origins. At school, Evan gradually developed new skills. His reading improved, he was good at basic math, and he especially enjoyed arts and crafts periods because he could draw or build wooden models. Some teachers noted that Evan had strong visual memory but couldn't recall family events from his early years. Yet this was not considered a problem, as children from difficult home situations often exhibited similar patterns. The boy continued to call Raymond Dad because that was the only term Raymond permitted. No one knew he had once had a different family. There were no reports from neighbors, teachers, or doctors about strange behavior, and Evan's lack of close friends was seen as a personality trait rather than a warning sign. All of this allowed Matthew's new identity formation to proceed completely smoothly. From a social perspective, Evan was simply a boy living a modest life with his father, new to town, well-behaved, and never causing trouble. From an administrative standpoint, Evan was a legally recognized child on paper, accepted by the school system, with new health records and no violations of any rules. There were no inconsistencies in residency data or school documents to draw attention. From the community's viewpoint, Evan's presence was no different from that of many children from less privileged families, common in Appalachia at the time. That ensured that throughout Evan Pierce's entire childhood, no one, whether by accident or intent, ever saw the fracture of a stolen identity. By the 1980s, the disappearance of Matthew Long had gradually faded into obscurity within the Roanoke Police Department's administrative system. The case file, once kept in the main investigation unit's storage cabinets, was moved through various warehouses due to changes in department facilities. Initially, the entire file was contained in 3 boxes of paper records, each holding hundreds of notes, crime scene photos, diagrams, and witness statements. When the detective division was reorganized in 1981, the file was temporarily relocated to the basement of the old headquarters. then a few years later, transferred to the city's central archive, along with dozens of other unsolved cases. With each move, portions of the documents were lost or mixed up. Crime scene photos became faded. Witness statements were no longer attached to their corresponding dated reports, and the list of 79 green Ford vehicles was left with only incomplete photocopies. The absence of electronic management meant storage relied entirely on the individuals manually entering records. The case titled Long, Matthew Missing Child, 1972, appeared in the Master Index but showed no signs of periodic review. After nearly 8 years with no new leads, the file was only reopened when a young officer, John Merritt, stumbled upon it while reviewing old missing persons cases for an internal training course on child investigation procedures. Merritt, then 27 and newly transferred from Richmond, was tasked with selecting an old case to practice cross-referencing procedures. Reading through the Matthew Long file, he was drawn to its clarity, yet lack of resolution. A child vanishing in broad daylight in a residential area, multiple witnesses, scant physical evidence, and a suspect vehicle that was never fully tracked down. Merritt began copying the remaining documents into a working notebook, trying to reorganize them chronologically. However, the deeper he went, the quicker he realized the surviving data was insufficient for a reinvestigation. Many original reports had ink that had faded, photocopied witness statements lacked signatures, and some pages were damaged by mold. More critically, most of the physical evidence collected in 1972, such as the drawing paper, broken pencil, or soil samples from the scene, had been destroyed during a 1979 evidence purge under storage regulation. With no physical evidence or forensic traces left, Merritt could only reconstruct the investigation from paper records. He tracked down former investigators, but most had retired or moved away. One vaguely recalled a tip about a green car heading toward Appalachia that no one followed up on, while another simply remembered the case being classified as completely stalled. Merritt tried contacting the DMV to rescreen the 1972 list of green Ford vehicles registered in Roanoke, but the DMV's storage system had completely changed. Old records were transferred to microfilm and could not be searched quickly. Obtaining an equivalent list required administrative orders and weeks of waiting, far beyond his authority as a training officer. Every attempt to recover information was blocked by the reality that the case existed too far in the past, with no original data left to verify. Merritt noted in his workbook that the Long case is a textbook example of the limits of pre-digital investigations: many witnesses, little evidence, and no cross-state support systems. At the end of the training course, he submitted an internal report recommending that similar child disappearances in the future be digitized to prevent data loss. However, his suggestion was simply filed with the training records, and no concrete action was taken. After Merritt completed the assignment, the Matthew Long file was once again shelved among hundreds of others. In 1986, when the police headquarters moved to a new building, all old files were boxed and transferred yet again. When warehouse staff created the new catalog, they only recorded the case name without re-entering full details. In subsequent years, the file was moved 2 more times, losing a few more pages each time. By the late 1980s, when Roanoke PD began implementing microfilm storage, the Matthew Long case consisted only of a thin folder containing the initial report, a shortened witness list, and a summary of 212 unresolved leads. No one in the new generation of officers knew the full story, and none of the original investigation team remained on active duty to remind anyone. In the department's annual summary reports, Matthew Long's name still appeared on the list of missing children with unknown whereabouts, but only as a single brief line, "No progress." Outside the administrative sphere, community memory of the case also faded. Those who had known the Long family or participated in the search gradually moved away, and homes in the neighborhood were sold to new residents who knew nothing of the 1972 incident. Meanwhile, a national missing child alert system did not yet exist, and the Matthew Long case lived on only as a statistic. By 1990, When John Merritt had become a seasoned detective, he still remembered the old file, but admitted there was no data left to work with. After nearly 2 decades, the Matthew Long case had become a silent symbol of a generation of investigations constrained by technology and bureaucracy. A case erased from systemic memory by time and the lack of interstate connectivity. 43 years after Matthew Long vanished from Roanoke, now living under the name Evan Pierce, he led a quiet life in Charleston, West Virginia, not far from the town where Raymond had once settled. After Raymond died in the early 1990s, Evan kept the old house, fixed the roof, and continued living there while working at a building supply store. His life was simple and uneventful, yet for many years an inexplicable void remained regarding his own origins. Raymond had never provided details about the past, only saying vaguely that everything before Beckley wasn't worth remembering. As he grew older, Evan began noticing fragments of his foster father's story that didn't add up. No childhood photos from before Beckley, no relatives who ever contacted them, and his birth certificate was a replacement copy, marked no original record on file. When he reached his 50s, these discrepancies started to make him uneasy. In 2015, while talking with his older daughter, Michelle, about creating a family tree for a school history project, Evan admitted he knew nothing about his ancestors beyond the name Pierce. Michelle, familiar with technology and the growing popularity of commercial DNA testing services in the U.S., suggested he send a sample to one of the genealogy platforms to discover his roots. Evan initially hesitated. He had never cared about his biological origins, but Michelle convinced him it was just a simple test that would reveal which part of Europe his bloodline came from. He finally agreed. On March 12, 2015, the testing kit arrived at the house, a small vial, instructions, and a return envelope. Evan filled out the form as Evan R. Pierce, signed the consent to share data for genealogical research, followed the instructions to provide a saliva sample, and mailed it back. The sample was sent to the company's lab in California, where the DNA analysis process was automated to identify genetic markers and compare them against millions of samples in the database. For Evan, it was just a fun experiment with no real expectations. He never considered anything might be abnormal because throughout his life every document, birth certificate, driver's license, medical records, marriage certificate, bore the same name, all valid and never questioned. After mailing the sample, Evan forgot about it for weeks. The company's system said results would take 6 to 8 weeks, and he paid no attention. Michelle, however, was excited and frequently checked the account for updates. By mid-May, the results notification appeared. Evan's DNA profile was complete and uploaded. When Michelle opened the page, the first anomaly she noticed was in the ethnicity estimate section. His genetic makeup did not match the family lore about the Pierces. Instead of the mixed English-Scottish background Raymond had mentioned, the results showed primarily Northern European with German and Irish ancestry, plus a small percentage typical of Central Appalachian natives in Virginia, rather than West Virginia. The more significant section was DNA matches. The system reported dozens of close connections, including 3 individuals with unusually high match levels, equivalent to first or second-degree relatives. All 3 carried the surname Long and lived scattered across Virginia and Maryland. Michelle initially thought it was a coincidence, but when she examined the centimorgan values, the unit measuring genetic similarity, she saw they all exceeded 2,000 cm, which only occurs among immediate blood relatives. This discrepancy made Michelle suspect a registration error, and she immediately contacted the company for verification, only to be told the data had been automatically checked multiple times and errors were virtually impossible. When she recounted this to Evan, he fell silent. He had never heard the name Long and certainly couldn't imagine any connection to Virginia, but curiosity drove him to log in and view the full results himself. When Evan opened the detailed analysis page, the system displayed a genetic tree showing that none of the Pierce branches he had entered appeared anywhere in the database. Not a single individual with the surname Pierce matched his DNA even at a distant level, and the matching algorithms found no similarity whatsoever with the Pierce genetic cluster in West Virginia, Kentucky, or Ohio, the areas where his family had lived. Instead, the closest genetic relatives list was dominated by one surname, Long. That surname occupied the top 8 spots in the close family, first or second cousin range category, including names Evan had never heard, such as David Long, Rebecca Long Carter, and Thomas E. Long. One profile even listed an address in Roanoke, Virginia, a town name that faintly echoed the vague old place Raymond had rarely mentioned. When Michelle looked at the detailed genetic statistics, she saw the match levels were extraordinarily high, exceeding the 99.9% threshold for direct line relatives, meaning parent-child or full sibling relationships. She sat silently in front of the screen for a while, said nothing, then printed the entire report to give to her father. Evan read line by line without fully understanding the terminology, but the short conclusion at the end chilled him. No detectable genetic relationship to the Pierce family. Strong matches with individuals of the Long surname Virginia. High probability of first-degree blood relation. For the first time in his life, he had to confront the possibility that the name Pierce was not his, that everything he had believed about his family origins might be nothing more than a shell. He called the testing company again to double-check, fearing the sample had been swapped or there was a technical mistake, but customer support confirmed the analysis used 2 independent algorithms and the chance of error was essentially 0. They also explained that his identifying DNA showed no shared sequences with any Pierce individual in the system, meaning no blood relation to the family whose name he bore. Meanwhile, the Long cluster displayed near absolute similarity scores, especially with a person named David Long, whose profile showed he was born in 1966 in Roanoke, Virginia. That birth year matched Evan's official records, and the coincidence made the suspicion undeniable. If the data was correct, these Long individuals were not just from the same region, they could be his siblings or parents. Fragments of memory Evan had long ignored began surfacing. Hazy dreams of a house with a white wooden porch, a woman's voice calling a name, the smell of wall paint, and the sound of a car driving away early in the morning, images he had once dismissed as imagination. Now they started fitting together like strange puzzle pieces. Michelle urged her father to reach out to one of the Long matches to verify directly. Evan hesitated, but curiosity and anxiety overpowered fear. He sent a simple message through the platform. "Hello. My name is Evan Pierce. The system shows we have a very close genetic relationship. I don't understand why, but I'd like to learn more about my origins." The next day, a reply came from David Long. The message was short, polite, and stunned. "I was shocked to see this result. My family had a little brother who went missing in Roanoke in 1972. If you're willing, we can talk." Reading that, Evan felt the world go quiet around him. The year 1972 froze him. The year he was supposedly 6 years old according to his documents, the exact age of Matthew Long in the public records. Michelle later found mentioned in an old online article after seeing the surname match. She dug further and discovered a 1972 missing child case in Roanoke, Virginia, about a 6-year-old boy named Matthew Long, who vanished without a trace on his way to school. She showed her father the article, and when he saw the faded age-progress sketch of the child, Evan felt a wave of dizziness. Not because the face was an exact match, but because of a deep sense of recognition, like seeing himself at a moment erased from memory. The DNA results didn't just completely negate any Pierce ancestry, they revealed a truth Evan could no longer deny. Every document, every story about his past, and even the name he had carried for over 40 years could all be false. A genealogy system intended only to trace ancestry had become the first concrete evidence that his true identity had never belonged to Evan Pierce, but was likely tied to a name buried for more than half a century, Matthew Long. After the initial shock when the DNA results completely denied any connection to the Pierce family, Michelle decided to take one step further by using genealogical triangulation, the technique of cross-referencing 3 genetic matches to pinpoint the exact relationship between her father and the cluster of people carrying the surname Long that had appeared in the system. She contacted the testing company's data support team to request access to the advanced analysis mode, which allows simultaneous comparison of genetic overlap among multiple individuals. The lab granted permission because all parties involved had enabled open data sharing. Michelle submitted a request for triangular analysis among 3 samples: Evan Pierce's DNA, David Long's DNA, and the DNA of a woman named Rebecca Long Carter, whom the system had flagged as having an equally close blood connection. After nearly a week of processing, a report nearly 20 pages long arrived, listing in detail the chromosome clusters, the number of matching centimorgans, and comparison charts of the corresponding DNA segments. The match between Evan and David Long reached 2,425 cm, an extremely high figure that only appears in immediate first-degree relationships, specifically parent-child or full siblings. The match between Evan and Rebecca was 1,825 cm, falling within the range for aunt, niece, or nephew or full sisters. When Michelle forwarded these results to an independent group of genetics experts on a genealogy forum, the response came almost instantly: "There is no doubt left. This is a direct line blood relationship. Evan Pierce and David Long are most likely full siblings or parent-child. Based on birth years, the higher probability is full siblings." Those numbers left Evan barely able to look away from the screen. For the first time in his life, he had before him biological proof, undeniable, that the blood running through his veins did not belong to the name Pierce. Michelle continued to expand the analysis by adding data from 12 other Long relatives in the system. When the full triangulation chart was completed, every intersection point converged on a single genetic cluster, the Long Roanoke cluster. The sequence matches showed not only close kinship, but also the presence of distinctive genetic markers found only within the same lineage, including a 27.4 cm identical segment on chromosome 9 and a 41.2 cm segment on chromosome 15. 2 locations that experts identify as markers typically passed down intact across generations. When cross-referenced with publicly available DNA from living Long descendants, the match rate between Evan and the Long descendants reached 99.9987%, a level equivalent to forensic identity confirmation. The final summary report stated clearly in its conclusion, the DNA samples belong to the same family unit. Based on centimorgan values, Evan Pierce has a direct line blood relationship with individuals of the Long surname in Roanoke, Virginia, consistent with the position of the missing child in historical records. When Evan read that line, he could hardly believe his eyes. He asked Michelle to call the lab to verify the entire process again, afraid it was all just a statistical coincidence. The company confirmed that the data had passed multiple layers of validation and was of absolute reliability. They even sent an additional relationship likelihood curve chart showing the probability of various relationships. On that graph, the curve indicated a 99.97% probability that Evan and David were full siblings, while the likelihood of a parent-child or uncle-nephew relationship dropped to virtually 0 due to mismatched generational gaps in ages. To eliminate any remaining chance of error, Michelle contacted David Long directly through the genetic data sharing feature. David agreed to submit a fresh DNA sample to the same lab for retesting on next-generation equipment. The second set of results, received 3 weeks later, matched the previous report exactly, confirming that Evan and David shared 50% of their DNA, the unmistakable signature of full siblings with the same parents. At this point, the question of Evan's true identity had essentially been answered by science. Every factor lined up: year of birth, geographic location, DNA metrics, the Long family in Roanoke, and the 1972 missing person record. In online genealogy groups, volunteer experts further analyzed historical census data and public family trees and discovered that the Long family had 2 sons, David born in 1966 and Matthew born in 1966, a few months apart, but Matthew vanished at age 6. Both boys shared a distinctive genetic marker that Evan and David now both carried, a rare 48.9 cm segment on chromosome 3, found only infrequently in the Virginia population. This discovery confirmed that Evan Pierce and Matthew Long were in fact the same person. The data was entered into the National Genealogical Triangulation Database, yielding an absolute match with the Long family's projected genetic profile, which had been supplemented by David's sample and 2 other relatives. Independent experts called it a perfect triangulation when 3 or more DNA samples pinpoint the exact same genetic intersection, eliminating any possibility of error. The final report was delivered to Michelle's account with a short but crushing conclusion. The DNA sample of Evan R. Pierce fully matches the genetic profile of the Long lineage in Roanoke, Virginia. The probability that Evan is Matthew Long, the individual who went missing in 1972, is 99.9992%. No alternative explanation exists. When Michelle printed the report and placed it in front of her father, the room fell silent. Evan stared at the words as his mind went numb. Layer after layer of buried memories seemed to rise. The voice of a woman calling his name, vague shouting, morning light filtering through a fence, the terror of being dragged away. He no longer had any doubt. He was the boy who had disappeared from Roanoke nearly half a century ago. Not Evan Pierce, not Raymond's son, but Matthew Long. The child whose disappearance had prompted an entire city to search in vain for months. The DNA evidence had put an end to every hypothesis and revealed a truth that had remained unspoken for 43 years. The child kidnapped in 1972 was still alive, and he himself carried that proof inside his own body. Once the DNA testing and genealogical triangulation confirmed that Evan Pierce was in fact Matthew Long, the boy who went missing in Roanoke in 1972, the case file was immediately transferred to the Federal Bureau of Investigation under the Protocol for Reactivating Cold Cases with Interstate Elements. The FBI's Crimes Against Children Division, working with the Western District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office and the Roanoke Police Department, reopened the investigation after more than 40 years of dormancy. The first objective was to re-examine every step of the original 1972 investigation to identify gaps and determine how Raymond Pierce, who had appeared on the 1972 suspect list, had managed to leave Virginia with the child without being detected. When the cold case unit arrived at the Roanoke PD archives, they located the remaining boxes of old files, a few yellowed reports, blurry crime scene photos, a list of 79 green Ford owners missing its final page, and the 1974 closing summary that marked the case inactive. The FBI digitized every document, cross-referencing dates, witness names, and report times. The original investigation was reconstructed as a timeline from 8:55 a.m. on March 12, 1972, when Matthew left the house, to the time the police were notified, and the search of Mill Mountain. When the events were resequenced, the team noticed something striking. Raymond Pierce's name appeared scattered throughout the list of green Ford owners, but had never been flagged as checked. An internal memo from the police chief at the time confirmed Pierce had been placed in the low priority category because he had no prior record and steady employment. Yet the same report noted that Pierce's residence lay along a route that could exit Roanoke westward, the exact direction toward the Appalachians, matching witness Henry Cole's statement about a pickup truck speeding away that morning. When the FBI reconstructed the travel map, they realized the western route had never been properly sealed off, a failure that the 1972 report itself had called a critical tactical misstep. Using average speed models for a Ford F-100, investigators compared the timeline to the moment Henry Cole saw the truck on Old Mill Road. The results showed that if the vehicle left the intersection just 2 minutes after Matthew vanished, it could easily have reached Cole's sighting location within the observed time frame. This proved that the Appalachia Road was not just a theory, but the only path consistent with real-time data. Investigators also discovered a handwritten DMV note from 1972 showing that Raymond Pierce had applied to change the license plate on his green Ford in April of that year. Only 3 weeks after the disappearance, but the paperwork was processed manually and never cross-checked against the open case. When the FBI traced records through archived microfilm, they located confirmation that the old plate, VJ341, had been swapped for WT102 at the Raleigh County, West Virginia DMV office, exactly when Pierce was recorded registering residency in Beckley. This timeline alignment made Raymond's movements crystal clear: departure from Roanoke around 9 a.m. on March 12, westward travel through the mountains, plate change within a month, and legalization of Matthew's new identity as Evan Pierce between April and May 1972. The FBI continued reviewing employment records and found that Raymond began working at a farm equipment repair shop in Beckley in late May, less than 3 months after the abduction. That date perfectly matched both the current DNA evidence and the forged birth certificate he had submitted to the county. When all the facts were connected, the task force realized that the single most promising investigative lead in 1972, Raymond Pierce, leaving Roanoke in a green Ford, had been overlooked due to misprioritization. Had a check been ordered, or the Appalachian truck sighting verified immediately, the case might have been solved within the first few days. The FBI report detailed how administrative overlap, erroneous risk assessment, and lack of coordination between local agencies had allowed a child abduction to become a lost file for over 4 decades. The team also cross-checked Raymond's Beckley residency records, which showed him living with a 6-year-old child, exactly Matthew's age at the time of the disappearance. The landlord recalled that Raymond introduced the boy as his biological son, with valid birth certificate and paperwork, so no one questioned it. The FBI confirmed that Beckley never received any alert about the Virginia missing child case because no interstate notification system existed in 1972. The summary report of the archival review concluded, all retrospective evidence indicates that Raymond Pierce transported a minor across state lines in a vehicle matching the abduction description and succeeded in establishing a new identity for the victim. The 1972 investigation failed to detect this primarily due to the absence of data sharing systems and failure to blockade the western route. After reconstructing the timeline, the FBI determined that the Appalachia direction, once dismissed as speculation, was the decisive missed opportunity that caused the Matthew Long case to stall. Mistakes in the first 48 hours, from downplaying Henry Cole's report to not fully checking the green Ford owner list, had allowed Raymond Pierce to leave Virginia undetected. The final FBI synthesis closed with the note, had modern investigative protocols been applied in 1972, this case could have been resolved within a week. Once the FBI had fully mapped Raymond Pierce's 1972 route from Roanoke to Beckley, the next phase was to locate the places he had lived with Matthew in the early years after the abduction. Using property records from the Raleigh County Assessor's Office, investigators found a lease agreement for a small wooden cabin on the southern edge of Beckley, near Little Beaver State Park. The contract, signed on May 2, 1972, in Raymond Pierce's name, was for 1 year and explicitly noted, tenant plus 1 minor. The address matched the area Matthew, under the name Evan Pierce, had once described to his daughter as growing up in the woods, just the 2 of us. Although the cabin had been abandoned for decades, the FBI cold case team and local police conducted a full scene examination. The house was decayed, roof partially collapsed, windows shattered, weeds choking the path, but the wooden frame remained recognizable. During the survey, forensic technicians reconstructed the interior layout from floor marks, stove placement, and partition traces, confirming 2 small bedrooms exactly as Evan had described. Beneath layers of dust and rotted boards, they recovered several items: a broken picture frame, crayon stubs, and a twice-folded faded child's drawing of a house with smoke rising from the chimney and 2 stick figures holding hands. On the back, written in faded green ink, were the words Evan and Dad. The ink and paper were collected, sealed, and sent for analysis. Under the floorboards of the smaller bedroom, technicians located an old tin box sealed with rotted tape. Inside, wrapped in plastic, were documents, a copy of a birth certificate for Evan Pierce, a 1973 health exam record from a Beckley clinic, and an elementary school ID card from Woodland Primary School, typewritten, bearing a photo of a brown-haired 6-year-old boy whose eyes matched those in Matthew's old missing person photo. Also in the envelope were several small handwritten notes by Raymond, grocery lists, receipts, and one simple note. Never mention Virginia, no one knows. Evan is real. That brief sentence was treated as the first direct evidence that Raymond was fully aware he was concealing the child's identity. Using ultraviolet light, forensic examiners detected faded ink on the main room's wall where a picture frame had once hung. Digital enhancement revealed the words, "Happy 7th Birthday Evan 1973, proving the child lived there at least 1 year after the abduction. Wall paint samples and the child's drawing were sent for biological trace analysis. Results showed trace DNA on the paper that matched Evan's current sample, confirming that Matthew himself had held or drawn on it as a young child. Fingerprints on the tin box matched archived prints from Raymond. These discoveries proved the cabin was where Raymond lived with Matthew in the immediate aftermath of the kidnapping. Investigators also found one additional critical detail. In a shed behind the cabin lay the rusted, disassembled frame of a Ford F-100. Beneath the rust, remnants of dark green paint were visible. The chassis number, still readable, ended in 341, matching the last 3 digits of the suspect plate, VJ 341, that Raymond had changed in 1972. This piece locked in that Raymond not only matched the profile and route, but owned the exact truck the witness saw carrying Matthew away from Roanoke that morning. Inside the cabin, more child items had survived time. A single old shoe, a rubber ball, and a small wooden picture frame, carved with Dad and Evan 1974. Under UV light on the back of that frame appeared faint pencil writing, "To Matthew. From Mom." The handwriting style matched samples of Evelyn Long's in old school records. It is possible the note traveled with whatever belongings Matthew had with him from his original home. Forensic analysts concluded that the cabin was not merely a residence, but the primary site where Raymond Pierce carried out the recreation of the abducted child's identity. Every layer of evidence, forged birth certificate, school ID, children's belongings, green Ford frame, aligned perfectly with the timeline the FBI had reconstructed. In the final scene report, the lead agent wrote, "The Beckley location is the bridge between Matthew Long's disappearance in Virginia and the false identity of Evan Pierce in West Virginia. All traces converge here, confirming the boy lived with Raymond Pierce for at least the first 5 years after the abduction." With a collection and full forensic examination of physical evidence, the FBI finally possessed irrefutable proof that Matthew had existed in that cabin, turning a historical suspicion into a fact verified by modern forensic science. When the physical evidence recovered from the Beckley cabin matched perfectly with Matthew Long's DNA data and personal records, the FBI moved to the next step, directly interviewing Matthew, the man who had lived more than 40 years under the name Evan Pierce, to retrieve childhood memories for comparison with the crime scene findings. Although Matthew consistently said he remembered nothing before living in Beckley, the investigators knew that childhood memories, especially those formed during trauma, often exist as fragments rather than complete sequences. The interview took place at the FBI office in Charleston, attended by a memory expert and a veteran investigator specializing in child abduction cases. Initially, they avoided asking directly about the 1972 disappearance and instead focused on prompting the earliest memories connected to the cabin. Matthew frowned for a long time when asked to recall the period when he was 6 to 10 years old, the exact time frame the FBI had established he lived in the cabin. He said his memories always started in Beckley, but when asked about specific sounds, smells, sights, or small details, fragments began to surface more clearly for the first time. Matthew remembered strong wind blowing through the trees, a sound he had always associated with childhood. This matched the cabin's location on the edge of Little Beaver State Park, where wind whipped hard through the pine canopy at night. When asked to describe the house, he closed his eyes and tried to picture it. There were 2 bedrooms, one big, one smaller. My bed was near the window. I remember the window got cold in winter. The investigator immediately noted this was accurate. The smaller bedroom had a north-facing window with a drafty seal that dropped the temperature in winter. When shown current photographs of the cabin, Matthew instinctively pointed to the left corner of the porch roof. There was a hook there. Raymond used it to hang a lantern, I think. Indeed, the FBI had found a rusted iron hook in almost exactly that spot, used to hang an oil lantern because the cabin had no electricity in the early years. When the memory expert asked about objects, Matthew recalled a silver tin box, but didn't know what was inside. When the FBI told him they had recovered a tin box from the cabin containing a forged birth certificate and personal documents, Matthew fell silent for a long time. He said, "I don't know what was in it. I just remember Raymond kept it under the floor and told me never to open it." This matched the scene perfectly. The box had been found beneath the floorboards of the smaller bedroom, located with UV lights and specialized tools. As they continued probing sensory memories, Matthew said he used to be woken as a child by the smell of damp wood and smoke. The investigator instantly cross-referenced the cabin used a wood-burning stove as its only heat source, and the FBI had documented heavy soot around the stove area consistent with his description. Matthew added that he remembered feeling scared when Raymond slammed the cabin door hard at night, like he was afraid someone was coming. He didn't know why. Only that Raymond would whisper, "No one's allowed in here, Evan. Remember that." This drew particular attention from the FBI, because among the notes recovered in the cabin, Raymond had written, "Never mention Virginia again. No one knows anything." The 2 pieces of information corroborated each other, revealing Raymond lived in constant high alert, typical of someone hiding an abducted child. When asked about toys, Matthew recalled an old red ball. This matched a rubber ball found in the cabin, now rotted and faded. Forensic specialists later used pigment analysis to confirm the remaining color traces were indeed red. An astonishing validation of Matthew's memory. Another key detail emerged when Matthew was asked about morning routines. Raymond always smoked on the front porch, menthol cigarettes. The investigator immediately checked the 1972 files. Witness David Long had described the suspicious driver as smoking cigarettes that smelled like mint. In the cabin, the FBI had recovered a menthol filter wrapper in the storage shed, previously of uncertain age, but Matthew's memory now dated it. When cross-referenced, this detail created a powerful link between Matthew's memories and Raymond Pierce's habits. When asked about his very first memory, Matthew said he recalled a narrow, tree-lined road, the car bouncing a lot, but didn't know where it was. The FBI determined this matched the description of Old Mill Road, the route Raymond took out of Roanoke toward the Appalachians. According to witness Henry Cole's 1972 statement, the agent asked if he remembered anything before arriving in Beckley. Matthew answered slowly. He only remembered crying and a woman's voice calling the name Matthew, but I thought it was a dream. When shown a 1972 media age progression sketch of Evelyn Long, Matthew didn't recognize the face, but he stared at the eyes for a long time and said, "I've heard a voice like that somewhere far away." This was the first time during the entire interview that Matthew directly referenced his childhood name. The interview lasted more than 3 hours. Every word was recorded, and every detail cross-checked against evidence from the cabin. The report's conclusion was clear. Matthew Long's memories, though fragmented, correspond to numerous physical and spatial elements at the Beckley cabin, including house structure, room layout, children's items, the tin box, wood smoke smell, and Raymond Pierce's menthol smoking habit. These details reinforce the DNA evidence and confirm that the boy missing since 1972 lived in this cabin for many years. Matthew left the interview room with heavy eyes, not because the memories had fully returned, but because the tiny fragments he had carried all his life had finally found their place in a story he never knew was his own. After completing Matthew's interview and confirming his childhood memories aligned remarkably with the Beckley cabin scene, the FBI moved to the next critical step: direct kinship verification between Matthew and his biological brother David Long. Although genealogical data and triangulation analysis had already shown near certain probability, an independent forensic DNA test was required to officially establish Matthew Long's identity in federal records. David Long, now living in Maryland, was contacted by the FBI and informed that one additional sample was needed to close the identification file to legal standards. Though the call shook him deeply, David agreed immediately. He said even the smallest ray of hope was enough for him to cooperate fully until a final conclusion. A team of FBI DNA technicians traveled to Maryland and collected samples at David's home following strict biological collection protocol: one buccal swab, one finger prick blood sample, and a backup hair with root. The samples were sealed in triple-layered tamper-evident kits labeled with anonymous case numbers to ensure blind analysis. At the same time, Matthew provided a third DNA sample under direct FBI supervision to eliminate any possibility of mix-up. All samples were transported to the FBI's Biological Analysis Unit at Quantico, the laboratory that specializes in cold cases and missing person identifications. Confirming full sibling relationship between two adult males required comparison of more than 21 STR loci, including highly variable markers such as D3S1358, FGA, CSF1PO, and D21S11. After 2 weeks, the preliminary report reached the case team. All 21 loci matched perfectly with no exclusions. The shared DNA percentage was 50.1%, exactly what is expected between full siblings. Additionally, two rare familial STR markers previously identified in the genealogical analysis on chromosomes 9 and 15 were identical. For further confirmation, the lab performed YSTR analysis, paternal line DNA. The Y haplogroup was identical, proving Matthew and David share the same father. The final report concluded the relationship between the two samples is full sibling, with both parents in common confidence level, 99.998%. No alternative hypothesis is compatible with the data. The report was forwarded to the case agent and federal prosecutor. At the Charleston FBI office, Matthew was invited to hear the results. On the table, the agent placed a sealed envelope marked Federal Identification Report, subject, Matthew Long. When he read the line, match confirmed, full sibling relationship with David Long, Matthew froze, staring at the paper for minutes. He had suspected it from the genealogy results, felt it from the scattered memories, sensed it intuitively, but this was the first time his life saw the truth, written in the indisputable language of forensic science. A man who had lived his entire adult life as Evan Pierce was finally officially Matthew Edward Long again. The case notes recorded, subject displayed strong emotion but remained fully cooperative. Awareness of restored identity clearly reinforced. David Long received the results the same day. When told he is your biological brother, David broke down, not from shock, but because 4 decades of believing Matthew was dead had just collapsed completely. The Long family, clinging to the thinnest thread of hope, now had confirmation that Matthew was alive and sitting in an FBI office only hours away by car. With verification complete, the FBI officially changed Matthew Long's federal status from missing presumed deceased to recovered. Identity confirmed, noting that the individual formerly known as Evan R. Pierce was the victim of the 1972 abduction. The name, Matthew Edward Long, was restored across all systems with full identifiers, case numbers, and records. The DNA conclusion not only served as crucial evidence in reconstructing the crime, but officially returned to Matthew Long the life that had been stolen from him in a few minutes on a morning nearly half a century earlier. Once the official DNA report confirmed Matthew Long was alive and was the man who had lived as Evan Pierce for over 4 decades, The FBI moved to the most sensitive task of the entire case, notifying the Long family. This step had to follow the strict protocol for long-term missing persons found alive. By this time, the Long family consisted only of David, Matthew's older brother, and a few close relatives. Their parents, Thomas and Evelyn, had passed away years earlier. The FBI first contacted David by phone, saying only that the FBI needs to meet in person to discuss developments regarding Matthew Long's file, without revealing details. David immediately understood something extraordinary had happened. In over 40 years, no agency had ever formally reopened the case. A team of 3 federal agents, a senior investigator, a forensic specialist, and a victim support counselor, traveled to Maryland the next morning. The meeting took place in David's living room, where a photograph of 6-year-old Matthew still hung on the wall, preserved as a reminder never to let the memory fade. When the lead agent began, he placed a thick, sealed envelope bearing the case number on the table. Inside were the DNA report, forensic comparison files, photographs of the Beckley cabin, and all supporting documents the FBI had gathered. Speaking slowly, the agent said, "Mr. Long, we have an official conclusion. We have found Matthew." David stared at them, speechless. The agent continued, laying the kinship confirmation in front of him. The 21 locus STR results, the YSTR chart showing perfect paternal line match, and the centimorgan count that left no room for any relationship other than full brothers. When David's eyes landed on probability of full sibling relationship, 99.9998%, he began to cry without another word. After several minutes, he managed his first question, "He's really alive?" The answer was firm. "Yes, sir. He is alive, in good health, and cooperating with the investigation." David's trembling hands turned the pages, childhood school photos of Evan Pierce that matched the bone structure of 6-year-old Matthew, the forged birth certificate Raymond filed in Beckley County, the tin box containing the child's documents, Raymond's note, "Never mention Virginia again." The agent presented additional physical evidence from the cabin, including the child's drawing, labeled Evan and Dad, whose DNA matched Matthew's current profile. Forensic examiners had confirmed the child DNA on that paper belonged to Matthew Long. No doubt could remain. After reviewing everything, David sat in silence for a long time, then said, "My parents, they died without ever knowing the truth." The counselor gently nodded, explaining this was a common reaction when a family recovers a loved one after decades, especially when the parents did not live to see it. The agent explained the sequence of events in terms understandable to the family, how Raymond Pierce fell off the suspect list in 1972, the absence of Western roadblocks, the limitations of interstate alerts at the time, and especially how Raymond's escape route matched the old witness statements. They did not blame the original police, but did not hide that major errors had allowed the case to go cold. When the agent placed a current photograph of Matthew, now in his 50s, next to the 1972 picture of the 6-year-old boy, David nearly collapsed at the unmistakable identical eyes. The rest of the meeting reviewed details Matthew had provided in his interview: the strong wind through the trees, the lantern hook, the cold window, the smell of wood smoke, and the woman's voice calling Matthew, that he thought was a dream. All of it matched the Long family records, their mother's voice, and the Roanoke house they once lived in. The FBI explained that these memories, combined with the forensic analysis and DNA, formed the foundation for the final conclusion. At the end of the meeting, David was asked to sign the official acknowledgement that he had been notified of Matthew Long's recovery, per federal long-term missing person protocol. He signed with a hand that would not stop shaking. Before leaving, one agent placed the case envelope back on the table and said, "Mr. Long, after 43 years, your brother is alive. We found him, and if you want to meet Matthew, we can arrange it." David could not speak, he only nodded, a nod that carried decades of buried pain, a relief he had never dared imagine, and a hope the Long family thought had vanished forever on that March morning in 1972. The FBI began arranging the reunion immediately after David signed the official notification, but they proceeded step by step with extreme caution because psychological analysts warned that a meeting after 59 years of separation could cause a powerful emotional shock to both sides. The first meeting was proposed to take place in Roanoke, the very place where the story began, and also where the Long family had once suffered their loss. Matthew, after several days of reflection and numerous sessions with the FBI's psychological counselor, agreed to return to the city he could barely remember, yet somehow still felt strangely familiar. He said simply, "I want to meet my family, even though I don't remember them." David received the time and location of the meeting in a brief notice, 10 a.m., June 14th, in a secure conference room at the FBI's Roanoke field office. When the day arrived, David showed up an hour early. He walked into the building, clutching a plastic-framed photograph of 6-year-old Matthew that had yellowed with age. He gripped it tightly, as if afraid that if he let go, everything about to happen would vanish just like it had 43 years earlier. In the adjacent room, Matthew sat with 2 agents and a psychologist. He was wearing a light blue shirt, his hands clasped together, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sensation of standing on the boundary between 2 lives. When the connecting door opened, the 2 men did not see each other immediately. David entered the room with a tense expression, while Matthew kept his eyes on the table, taking a deep breath. Only when the investigator said, "David, this is Matthew," did he look up. Their eyes met in that instant, one man seeing the shadow of the little boy he used to play with in the yard in 1972. The other seeing a stranger's face that somehow felt familiar enough to choke him up. David was the first to step forward. He could barely speak. Only a faint call escaped. "Matt." Matthew stood, but did not move toward him right away. He studied David closely, the lines on his face, the wrinkles around his eyes, the silver hair, then whispered, I'm sorry, I don't remember." David had not expected Matthew to remember. He just shook his head, his voice breaking, "You don't have to remember. It's enough that you're alive." That was the moment everyone else in the room looked away to give the 2 brothers space. David moved closer and hugged Matthew tightly, as if terrified he would disappear from his arms again. Matthew did not respond immediately, but a few seconds later, his body gradually relaxed, and his arms slowly wrapped around David's back, as though instinct recognized the connection that DNA and his fragmented memories had already confirmed. Once they had calmed down, the agents left the room so the brothers could have privacy. Their first conversation was not about big questions or explanations. It began with the smallest things, Matthew asking about his childhood, about their parents, about the house he had lived in but could not recall. David spoke slowly, sometimes pausing to catch his breath, telling him that Matthew used to love drawing, used to run around the yard every afternoon, used to love the red toy truck their father had made from wood. David recounted that morning in 1972, when the 2 brothers left the house together. When Matthew stopped at the intersection and David turned away for just a moment, he spoke softly, as if afraid of hurting his brother. "It was my fault, I didn't hold on to you." Matthew shook his head, his voice gentle but firm. "It wasn't your fault. I know that." When David showed Matthew old family photos, a few flashes of memory flickered and then faded. Matthew could not remember everything, but he recognized Evelyn's voice in an old cassette recording David had brought. When he heard her call, "Matthew, come in for breakfast," Matthew suddenly covered his mouth, tears falling without knowing why. It was not a complete memory, just a familiar feeling, a warmth he could not name. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. As it ended, David asked, "Do you want to come home? It's changed a lot, but I kept everything from Mom and Dad." Matthew hesitated, then nodded. "I want to try." Before leaving the building, they took a photo together, not at the FBI's request, but because Michelle, Matthew's daughter, who was waiting in Charleston, had asked for it. It was the picture that marked the moment 2 brothers separated for nearly 6 decades finally stood side by side, still alive, still recognizing each other through the blood in their veins. As they stepped out of the FBI building, The midday sun shone down on the city of Roanoke, the place that had once witnessed a disappearance and now became the setting for a reunion almost no one believed could happen. This was not the end of the story, but for the first time in 59 years, the Long family had back everything they had once lost. Immediately after the reunion at the FBI office, the lead agent proposed an important step to complete the reopened investigation file, taking Matthew and David back to the exact location of the 1972 abduction for an on-site comparison. Although not mandatory, comparing the scene across the two time periods could help the FBI definitively confirm the route, position, and geographical elements recorded in the original report. Matthew initially hesitated, but when David said, "I think you should see that place once. It's part of your story," he agreed. The next morning, they rode in an FBI vehicle to the western residential area of Roanoke, where the Long family home once stood. As the car turned onto the narrow street, Matthew felt a vague tension run down his spine, not a clear memory, but an indescribable sense of familiarity. The old white wooden house of the Long family was no longer intact. The new owners had renovated nearly everything: new paint, new windows, a rebuilt porch. But the ground and the position of the front steps remained the same. Matthew stood silently for a long time in the yard where he had once played with David as a 6-year-old boy. Even without clear images returning, he said, "I think I ran here." David pointed to the corner of the yard near the fence. "Yes, right there was the swing Dad built for you." When Matthew slowly walked to the fence and placed his hand on the wood, not the original fence, but the old feeling returned as an inexplicable lump in his throat. After leaving the old yard, the FBI took them along the route Matthew had walked the morning he vanished. The distance was shorter than Matthew had imagined, only about a 2-minute walk. Matthew stopped in the middle of the street and looked to the right where a neighbor once kept a flower bed. "I remember the sound of birds somewhere over there, not clearly," he said. David confirmed that in 1972, that row of houses had dozens of sparrows nesting, details Matthew could not have known unless he had walked this way. When the group reached the intersection where Matthew was last seen, the FBI had prepared an overlay map, superimposing 1972 photographs onto current satellite images. The road was now wider, the sidewalks newly paved with brick, and the trees on both sides replaced, but the intersection's layout remained the same. Matthew looked around for a long time, cautiously, as if searching for a memory locked away for decades. He did not speak immediately, only turned slowly in a circle, eyes fixed on the space in front of him. When the agent asked what he felt, Matthew answered softly, "Something happened here. I can't remember, but my chest hurts when I stand in this spot." David placed a hand on his shoulder without saying a word. The FBI began comparing the old investigation route with the current scene. They showed Matthew the exact spot where witnesses had seen the green Ford F-100, right at the edge of the intersection. Matthew looked at that patch of ground, now freshly paved, and frowned slightly. "I hear the sound of an engine. A very loud engine," he said slowly, unsure whether it was a real memory or just from reading the files. But when the agent asked, "Do you remember anything else? Smells? Sounds?" Matthew replied, "Cigarette smoke. Menthol." David froze and looked straight at the agent. That was the exact detail little David had reported in 1972 about the driver. Menthol cigarette smell. No one in the previous interviews had ever mentioned that scent to Matthew. The FBI immediately noted in the report, "Subject recalled detail matching original witness statement despite never being informed of it." Afterward, the agent asked Matthew to walk the exact path the boy had taken that day from the house to the intersection. Matthew walked slowly, sometimes stopping as if his body recognized small changes in the terrain. As he neared the intersection, he looked left to the spot where the truck had been parked. "I think I turned back to look at you," he said, pointing to where David had stood in 1972. "I wanted to say something, but I don't remember anymore," David answered, with a choked voice. "You did turn back. That's the thing I remember most clearly." After completing the comparison, the FBI guided Matthew further along the direction the truck was believed to have taken. Though much had changed, some stretches of dirt and side roads still retained their 1970s structure. As Matthew walked that section, he suddenly stopped. "This road was very bumpy," he said unexpectedly. David asked, "You remember that?" Matthew replied, "Just the feeling. But it's exactly the same." The agent noted that this memory matched Matthew's earlier interview description of a narrow road with lots of trees and very bumpy, consistent with the route toward Appalachia described by witness Henry Cole. When they returned to the starting point, Matthew stood still, looking over the entire area as if trying to piece together a stolen part of his childhood. He did not recover complete memories. He could not recall the stranger's face who lifted him into the truck. Could not remember how scared he had been. But his body, his sensations, his reactions to each location along the route, all aligned perfectly with the abduction scene. The FBI concluded in their report that although Matthew's memories were no longer intact, his physiological responses and vague recollections, matching the 1972 descriptions, proved he had indeed experienced the event right here. The on-site examination ended in silence. Matthew did not remember the last day of his life in Roanoke. But now he had stood again in the exact place, on the very road that had separated the two brothers for 59 years. And for the first time in his life, his story began to take clear shape. Although Matthew Long's identity had been restored, and the entire chain of major events in the 1972 abduction clarified through DNA, physical evidence, and memory corroboration, major questions still hung unresolved that the FBI had to admit could never be fully answered after nearly 6 decades. The biggest question, and the most persistent obsession, was Raymond Pierce's motive. There was no document, letter or note left behind explaining why he took Matthew from Roanoke. The cabin in Beckley contained only basic living items, no diary, no writings revealing mood or intent. Raymond never confided in anyone, had no relatives, no close friends, and co-workers only knew him as a quiet, reserved man who shared nothing about his personal life. The FBI reviewed mental health records, employment files, family background, and even scraps of paper found in the cabin, but nothing revealed why an ordinary man with no criminal record and no signs of violence suddenly abducted a 6-year-old boy on his way to school. There was no evidence of financial motive, jealousy, personal conflict, or prior dispute with the Long family. All the record showed was absolute silence. Raymond had taken the answer to his grave. Another question troubling the FBI was the possibility of other victims. Although there was no direct evidence Raymond committed similar acts before or after 1972, he had moved frequently during the 1960s and lived in isolation with no record of relationships. Employment records showed he had worked as a truck driver for several years, a job that allowed extensive travel and contact with remote rural areas where child disappearances in that era often went unreported. The FBI contacted police departments in 3 states to review missing child or unusual reports from that period. But most records before 1975 had been destroyed or lost due to lax storage practices. DNA cross-checking with national databases also found no irregularities linked to Raymond. Yet criminal psychologists acknowledged they could not completely rule out the possibility he had contact or involvement in other child-related situations without leaving a legal trace. It was also impossible to know whether Matthew's abduction was impulsive or premeditated. The fact that he prepared a fake birth certificate, changed license plates, and left the state within weeks suggested a certain level of planning, yet it did not reflect a clear criminal pattern. Experts concluded Raymond did not fit the profile of an abductor motivated by abuse or exploitation. There was no evidence in the cabin or Matthew's medical history of mistreatment. Instead, all evidence indicated Raymond raised Matthew as his own real child, sending him to school, taking him for medical checkups, and providing reasonably stable care. This made the motive even more baffling. Why do all of that, while simultaneously stealing an entire child's life, and destroying the Long family. Another gap lay in the investigative errors of 1972, mistakes that, even with full timeline reconstruction, the FBI could not undo. Witness Henry Cole reported the green Ford heading toward Appalachia, but it was not prioritized. The list of 79 green Fords omitted the entry, Pierce Raymond, not checked. No roadblocks were set up to the west, there was no federal missing child alert system, and the fake birth certificate filed in West Virginia was never cross-checked with Virginia records. All formed a chain of gaps that allowed the case to slip away within the first 48 hours. The FBI acknowledged this was a classic example of the era before information technology, federal databases, and the Amber Alert system existed. The mistakes of 1972 were not the fault of any single individual, but the result of an entire primitive system in which local police departments operated almost independently and records were not shared across state lines. Nevertheless, both the Long family and the modern investigative team had to face the reality that those shortcomings led to nearly 6 decades of separation. There is no way to know whether Matthew could have been found within hours, days, or weeks, if the procedures of that time had been better. No one can know whether their parents, Thomas and Evelyn, might have lived longer or suffered less if they had known their son was still alive. And there is no way to answer how Matthew's life might have turned out differently if he had never left that intersection on that morning. Most of the story has been brought to light, but the shadow of questions that will never have answers still looms over the case, leaving a regret that even modern forensic science cannot erase. The utterly unexpected return of Matthew Long, after 59 years missing, didn't just completely rewrite one family's story in Roanoke. It has become the textbook example of the power of modern genetic technology, especially DNA genealogy, a field that has exploded over the past decade plus and is radically changing how cold cases are recorded, investigated, and solved across the United States. For generations, police and investigators could only rely on witness statements, crime scene photos, fingerprints, and traditional methods that were limited, easily lost, and heavily dependent on the passage of time. Cases like Matthew's, no clear witnesses, no forensic evidence, no cross-state data, had virtually zero chance of ever being reopened. But in the 21st century, the rapid growth of commercial DNA testing created a tool that detectives in 1972 couldn't have dreamed of, the ability to trace bloodlines by comparing millions of genomes stored in private genealogy databases. Matthew's case is the perfect illustration of how this technology can break through decades-long walls of silence. It wasn't a new piece of evidence, it wasn't a surprise confession, it was a saliva sample sent in solely to find European ancestors, and science turned that single act into the master key that unlocked the entire case. The news instantly made waves in Virginia, where law enforcement agencies reported a sharp spike in interest in applying cross-matching DNA to decades-old missing persons cases. Several small police departments in Southwest Virginia that had long assumed their cold cases were hopeless have now begun working with the FBI and private labs to explore whether old remaining evidence can still yield viable DNA. Veteran investigators are also starting to recognize the value of genetic samples in identifying nameless victims, a problem that plagued them for half a century when countless unidentified bodies were buried without ever being named. On the social level, the Matthew Long case made Virginians realize that time is no longer an absolute barrier. Families who had lived with faint hope or had given up entirely began reaching out to nonprofit DNA testing organizations, hoping to shed light on disappearances from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. When newspapers ran headlines like "Man Missing 59 Years, Found Thanks to DNA Genealogy," editorials in Richmond, Fairfax, and Charlottesville analyzed the broader impact. How many cases thought dead are simply waiting for the right genetic puzzle piece? How many families could be reunited if just one DNA sample entered the system? And most importantly, what responsibility does this place on law enforcement when faced with a tool so powerful it far outstrips traditional investigative systems? Privacy debates flared up immediately. Some civil liberties groups worry that using commercial DNA data could be abused without strict oversight. On the other side, the majority of the public strongly supports it, arguing that if this technology can restore identity to the nameless and bring living people home to their families after decades, it is a tool that must be used responsibly, not feared. At the federal level, the Matthew Long case was cited in an internal FBI report on the value of genealogy in identifying abducted victims and tracing cross-state leads. Investigators noted that if this technology had existed a few decades earlier, hundreds of 1970s, 1990s disappearances could have been solved much faster, sparing families a lifetime of living and not knowing. The case also highlighted the role of triangulation analysis, a technique that not only finds the closest relatives, but reconstructs entire family branches to pinpoint a victim's exact identity. In Matthew's situation, the process combined multiple Long family DNA samples to create a genetic picture so solid it was impossible to dispute. The greatest impact of DNA technology, made crystal clear in this case, isn't just finding perpetrators or victims, it's healing. Matthew, who had lived his whole life with an invisible void in his memory, finally found where he belonged. The Long family, after nearly 6 decades of pain, finally got answers. And the Roanoke community, once haunted by the hopeless 1972 disappearance, now saw proof that no case is too old to recover the truth, if people are willing to apply technology the right way. In the end, the Matthew Long case has become one of the strongest proofs in Virginia and across America that DNA is not just a scientific tool. It is a bridge between present and past, a door that reopens stories thought forever closed, and a reminder that sometimes the truth is simply waiting to be found, inside every human cell. The journey of the Matthew Long case, stretching from a March morning in 1972 to the restoration of his identity in 2016, is a long chain of investigative efforts, systemic failures, unfillable gaps, and ultimately the triumph of science over the limits time had imposed. From the moment the 6-year-old boy vanished at an intersection near his Roanoke home, police launched the largest search the area had ever seen, sweeping the route to school, combing Mill Mountain Forest, checking suspicious vehicles, and interviewing dozens of witnesses. Yet, in the crucial first 48 hours, the golden window for recovering an abducted child, a series of critical mistakes occurred. The Appalachian escape route was not sealed. A list of 79 green Ford vehicles skipped checking Raymond Pierce. ATM camera footage that might have captured the car was overwritten, and cross-state information was never shared because no supporting system existed. Each small error formed a chain of failure that dead-ended the investigation within weeks. By 1974, the file was officially moved to cold case status, waiting only for new leads. Meanwhile, Raymond Pierce quietly left Virginia, swapped license plates, filed fake birth records, and built a new life for Matthew under the name Evan Pierce in Beckley. Without modern identification technology, and with states operating almost independently, the deception went completely undetected. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the file was shuffled through various archives, documents gradually disappeared, and no usable physical evidence remained. One young officer once tried to review the file, but concluded there was simply too little information to restart an investigation. During those years, Matthew grew up, went to school, worked, married, never knowing his entire life was built on a stolen identity. Everything appeared frozen forever until 2015, when Matthew, still living as Evan, mailed a DNA sample to a genealogy service just to find his ancestral roots. That simple, innocent act became the turning point that overturned 59 years of silence. The results did not match the Pierce family at all. Instead, they showed a strong match to the Long cluster in Virginia. When triangulation analysis confirmed a direct blood relationship with David Long, the FBI immediately reopened the cold case and reconstructed Raymond Pierce's entire timeline. travel direction, route, the Beckley cabin, and whatever physical evidence still existed. The cabin provided the missing pieces: forged birth certificate, a tin box of documents, child DNA traces, personal belongings, all proving Matthew had lived there for years. Matthew's fragmented memories of wood smoke smell, mountain wind, bumpy roads, and menthol cigarette odor perfectly matched the scene and 1972 witness statements. When DNA testing between Matthew and David Long returned a near-perfect sibling match, Matthew Edward Long's identity was officially restored. The Long family welcomed back the relative they thought lost forever. A case once deemed hopeless finally had its answer. The reason the case lasted 59 years was not only that the perpetrator died before the truth came out, but because 1972 lacked DNA technology, nationwide databases, Amber Alerts, traffic cameras, and any way to verify false identities. All of those absences combined allowed Raymond Pierce to vanish with a child in just hours. Only in 2015, 2016, when DNA genealogy made it possible to trace family from the tiniest genetic fragments, could the case be reopened and brought to a final conclusion. At the end of 2016, the FBI completed its closing report. The abduction of Matthew Long was solved. The victim's identity was confirmed, the period lived under false identity was clarified, and the file was closed after 59 years, not for lack of clues, but because the truth had finally been found. Matthew Long, the boy who disappeared from Roanoke in 1972, is no longer just a name on a missing children list. He has returned to his true self, living proof that even the longest cases can find resolution when technology and human perseverance align. Matthew Long's story is not only the solving of a nearly 6-decade-old case, it clearly mirrors social issues Americans still face today. Society's reliance on technology for personal safety, the vulnerability of children when systems remain unconnected, and the vital role of community and family in spotting danger. The fact that Matthew was taken in an instant from a quiet Roanoke neighborhood shows a truth that remains valid. Even the seemingly safest places can harbor risk, and adult vigilance is irreplaceable. The green Ford that was never verified in the first 48 hours, and the list of 79 vehicles that overlooked one, are reminders that when it comes to child safety, rapid response and clear procedure are always the first line of defense. In today's fast-paced America, where children constantly move between school, extracurriculars, and neighboring communities, parents can learn that maintaining communication, checking schedules, and noticing anything unusual is absolutely critical. But the deepest lesson comes from that 2015 moment when Matthew submitted his DNA just to learn his family origins. DNA technology, something that didn't exist in 1972, did what an entire police force could not. It returned a person's true identity. This reminds us that in an increasingly tech-dependent society, keeping records, verifying personal data, and maintaining control over one's own biological information can serve as crucial protection. The Matthew Long case also shows that family patience and love can endure across time. David kept his little brother's photo for 59 years, and that photo, together with David's DNA, opened the door to truth. In today's often disconnected American family life, the story is a reminder that small acts like preserving old photos, maintaining family records, or staying in touch across generations have real value, sometimes value that can change or save someone's entire life. If Matthew Long's 59-year journey of resilience inspires you, hit subscribe so you don't miss more stories decoded through truth and perseverance. Thank you for joining us. See you in the next video, where we'll keep exploring mysteries that have slept far too long.